To Socialism for All. This is S4A Livestream number 113, being recorded on March 18, 2024. I am joined at twitch.tv/Socialism S4A, which is where we're recording this, by 48 viewers so far. We're doing kind of a surprise stream today. I am having a rough start here recording. Hopefully that will improve as things go on. Basically, we were going to do this stream on Thursday. I just had some personal stuff come up. I'm fine, but I just wasn't able to do this stream. So the weekend went through, and then we're doing it today. I think this is actually the first Monday stream that we've ever done, and no, I don't plan to start doing them on Mondays normally, but I think it's a decent makeup day, so I was able to do it today. Hence, we are recording. And I actually plan to record number 114 this Thursday, so there might be 2 streams this week. I have a ton of articles that have piled up and want to get to those. So, all right, let's see what's going on in the chat first of all. And while I'm bringing that up, we will also thank the patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. Patreon.com/socialismforall. or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. If you value this content, it's non-commercial. We don't run ads. We don't do sponsorships. It's just viewer supported. So if you like it, thank me. Also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, because that is what lets me keep spending so much time on this and planning more and more content. We've expanded the channel. I think I'm finally getting, after 4 years of doing some of the foundational work and trying what other people do, reaction videos and a little bit of drama for a while, I'm starting to get an idea of what I actually want this channel to be now that I've sort of caught up. There was a lot of catching up initially to, I didn't really listen to communist YouTube or anything previously, and so starting this channel, I wanted to do audiobooks, I wanted to read, and I wanted to vent and rant. And catching up with a lot of the other channels, I actually was not that impressed with a lot of the other channels, especially after I read more history and theory and started realizing, hey, almost no one knows what the fuck they're talking about. So anyway, yeah, after 4 years of that, I decided to just say fuck it, and we're going to do what we do, which includes Marxist fundamentals, as well as specific playlists of anti-revisionist content. Right now we are working on the first wave US anti-revisionist playlist. Little by little we're getting through that. That is anti-Browderism. Earl Browder was the general secretary of the Communist Party of the US, CPUSA, still exists, at least nominally, and was a really excellent communist and wrote some really good stuff. I can see why he was general secretary. And then during World War II, did this complete about-face, a lot of the same kinds of positions about, quote, peace-loving imperialists that could be, worked with on a peaceable basis that we would hear from Khrushchev in the modern revisionist era of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. A lot of would-be Marxists really still have not grappled with any of that there were, seeds sown for what would become the revisionist complete demise and liberalization of the USSR as early as the 50s and 60s, and maybe even a little bit. I was reading a very interesting thing recently about how some of the difficulties, even going back to the NEP, and that conflict between the petty bourgeoisie and the proletariat, may have laid some of the seeds of instability, if not revisionism, which were then capitalized on by the revisionists. But anyway, really wish I had gotten started with the anti-revisionist content sooner, but we're doing it so that anybody who is trying to get started now can get a quality anti-revisionist Marxist education, and we will be trying to take that on in a really head-on way, along with, again, fundamentals, doing capital and stuff like that. All right, so thanks again to supporters at patreon.com/socialismforall and buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. This is the content that you're helping to create, and If you value this channel, thank me, but also thank a supporter and consider becoming one yourself. So let's get into that chat. As I was saying, 48 people in the chat. We have a ton of stuff I want to cover today, but I do want to come out and shake hands with the folks, see what's going on in the chat. So, I've never made it to a single live stream before, but I'm going to pretend Monday is a shock to me. Yeah, like I said, this probably won't become a regular day, but I did happen to have an opening and needed to catch up on last Thursday's missed stream, so there we go. All right, and I did put a notification out on Patreon and Blue Sky and Mastodon now, so we may see some people joining from that in a little bit. And yes, thanks to Crow Girl for giving a shout out. As I was saying on Blue Sky, I don't play the game, so I don't get a ton of shout outs usually, but thank you for the shout out as far as the list of channels that do COVID stuff that aren't necessarily just COVID channels, so yeah. And thanks to our mods as well. I see Brit is here, also Shakespeare and Health Revolt. I'm not sure if they're here yet, but verbal reminder, don't feed the troll. I do like to go through the chat in order, so if people are arguing with trolls, it just clogs up the chat, and that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to have more of a focused discussion, kind of like a classroom, so you know, talking about the topic and not just, you know, arguing with people. What's on the agenda today? Well, I guess we can do a quick rundown. I've got a couple of, what do we have? Some Q&A, some questions that people asked on the YouTube comments that I wanted to highlight. Some kind of general U.S. economy current events, like Dollar Tree, Family Dollar closing a bunch of stores, the most layoffs since 2009 in general, all signs that we're heading into a big recession, which we've been talking about more and more over the last 6 months, because I do think that that is beginning. We're going to do a COVID update, as usual, the state of things per the wastewater on BioBot, as far as how much COVID is currently spreading, and then also just a few articles related to the ongoing COVID pandemic. Going to do some stuff on Joe Biden and how, I mean, kind of all aspects of Joe Biden, you know, who is formally now campaigning for re-election and is facing some significant pushback even from the Democratic Party base. Biden is a very right-wing Democrat, even by Democratic Party standards. And the thing with Israel's genocide is, I mean, a huge issue. We'll cover that in and of itself, but also in relation to Biden and the politics. So some things on that. What else? I have a few articles about unions that we may look at. There's some efforts to destroy the National Labor Relations Board in the U.S. We'll have a little discussion of that. Again, some of the economy stuff. Actually, I didn't realize I have, I'll put some other stuff in the economy section. And I think that that's probably going to be it for today. I say that that's going to be it. It's actually a lot of articles that just happen to break down into a few categories. But for the next live stream, which I've already started pulling articles for, this is 114 I think we're going to do on Thursday. There's a possibility I might be busy again this Thursday, but if not, we'll do it soon. So sometime in the next week we'll do 114. And I want to cover, being that this is an election year, I did in 2020 a rundown of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, PSL, their platform, and compared it to the Green Party US, their platform. Give people an idea of some of the larger left parties in the US. As communists, we would have criticisms of both PSL and Greens. I mean, PSL is a socialist party. I think that there are some criticizable things there, though. And Green Party, not explicitly a socialist party, although there is an eco-socialist wing of it, but a left party. There are some more kind of contrarian, petty bourgeois elements in that party. But we could look at what are their platforms that they're running their presidential candidates on, and people, I think in general, have given up on political struggle in the US, and that is in some ways tied to the economic struggle, but I'd really like to see people engaging more in the struggle and outside the Democratic Party, taking whatever steps forward. People may not be super experienced. There's not like a great tradition of political struggle outside the Democratic Party, which is an imperialist 1% controlled party. You can't really do effective struggle in there for more than just crumbs, and we want more than crumbs. There's not like a great tradition of struggle in a really mass way outside of the Democratic Party. And I would really like to see people taking whatever next steps their level of insight and knowledge, suggests to them, and then we can criticize and comment on it, and hopefully try to help guide and improve that. That to me is the goal. It's not just have everybody pop out a communist immediately. I didn't become a communist immediately. It was after some trial and error, some left impulses that I later refined and improved upon, and then you end up a communist. This is Lenin also suggested this, that communists get involved in United Front type activity with non-communist proletarian elements, not because they were super great, but to help increase their class consciousness and improve the movement, etc. And I think that more of that needs to happen. If we don't at least look at the left options in front of us and engage with them in some way, I don't know how we think the situation is ever going to get any better. You can vote Democrat all day long. It's just never going to get better. Obviously, another COVID thing and some articles there. We do that every stream, more on Israel's genocide in Gaza. We're going to also revisit the artificial intelligence and UFO threads that we started, I guess that was like back over the summer. And interestingly enough, there was a bunch of AI articles that popped up recently and that I wanted to cover, and then some actual UFO stuff as well. And what was actually going on with all of this hype around UFOs last year looks like, that may actually be the basis for a new surveillance system. So we'll get into that. And then from there, I want to go into some other stuff on, I don't know what to call it, just U.S. military type stuff that might not be on people's radar. And then actually I have a few other things that may or may not fit in the stream related to... I wanted to go back and cover the Next Benedict story, and then also some more stuff on the far right. And we'll see. Yeah, it might be 3 streams in there, but that's what I got coming up. So lots and lots of stuff pulled, but trying to break it up into chunks that we can actually address, in one stream, and not try to bite off more than we can chew. S4A's audiobooks are awesome. I used to listen to Mark's Madness a lot, but I find the new host to be kind of insufferable. I'm not actually familiar with Mark's Madness, so I don't know what you're talking about there, but always good to have that feedback. I love the commentary and dissection of the material. Well, that's what I was saying about, now that I've been doing this for 4 years, I have a good grasp on the fundamentals and have more of an idea of like designing playlists as curricula. Like we did the Sino-Soviet split miniseries playlist. There's a lot more you could read on that, but I wanted to at least give an overview of it. And we're doing this first wave U.S. anti-revisionism playlist, etc. I'm trying to build in commentary so that even beginners can jump into that content and understand what is being discussed, because I really wish somebody had been doing more of this when I was getting started, and it might not have taken me 4 years. I mean, it took me up to this point in my life to just even start really researching communism this much. That alone just cost me a lot of time. And then even when I did start reading communism, I spent several years dealing with like blatantly revisionist, distortions of Marxism before I got to the good stuff. So trying to feed that back into the process and help newcomers to, just get the quickest start that they can. How about that 1930s Earl Browder? What the fuck happened? Indeed. Indeed. The next thing I think we're going to read, at least from him, I might drop in a text or two that is adjacent to the playlist but not in it, related to social fascism and fascism. But the next thing we're going to read is his departure, where he starts talking about the Tehran Agreement in the early 40s between the UK, US, and USSR. And he starts coming out with like, oh, the US is not going to fight with the USSR anymore, and they've just accepted that they're here. And what are you talking about? That is not what went down at all after the war. You know, Churchill gives the Iron Curtain speech. And then you get domestically McCarthyism, the Taft-Hartley Act, the second Red Scare, and you get a major, major round of anti-communism. So that was not what happened at all. So yeah, good. I'm glad it's been a help in your education. Like I said, I started doing this because I felt like I needed to take my own education into my own hands, and you know, I'm glad it's helping other people, and the suggestions that people from the audience make to me are also super helpful. You know, I wouldn't have stumbled across a lot of this content if it wasn't for that dynamic interplay back and forth with commenters suggesting, you know, and I say commenters, it's like that sounds kind of condescending, almost like derogatory. There's people who are not just commenters, but people I'm in, you know, contact with and have been DMing with for some time, whose opinions I value, and the suggestions that all of those contacts have given have been, you know, hugely helpful and have helped to enrich the channel, so greatly appreciated, and another form of support. Walmart and Target are reportedly going to start a subscription that you'll be required to have if you want to use the self-checkouts. Interesting. Because everyone just wants to use the self-checkout so much, right? I mean, it's, you know, I went grocery shopping recently. I wound up doing like 10 minutes of free work for the store because, you know, sometimes they don't even have cashiers open, you know, so you have to do the self-checkout. And I had like a full cart of stuff. And so I'm sitting there doing like 10 minutes, you know, I should get like whatever the starting wage is at the supermarket. They should discount my bill for that because that's how much work I just did. Anyway. Welcome to everybody who's listening at work. Welcome. Browder was really cooking in the material S4A read out that CIA money must hit different. Well, technically the CIA didn't exist at that point. It was the OSS. But yeah, I mean, point taken, you know, imperialist corruption and intelligence services did exist. It's good to see a few Marxists give a fuck about COVID. Absolutely. I mean, I don't know how people... I haven't used as much of this messaging myself, but I do see other people using it that, like, supposed, quote, leftists not masking. You know, it's terrible to see people just giving into the complete capitulation of the entire U.S. medical and public health system about COVID, which is done exclusively in the name of profit. That's really what it's about. So if you are, you know, considering yourself anti-capitalist or leftist in any way, and you're not talking about how public health has been, I mean, they just basically aborted any COVID mitigation efforts in the name of capitalism. That's something you really need to get on quickly. Somebody's talking about boarding a plane. Somebody says, I hope your plane isn't a Boeing. What is going on with Boeing lately? There's wheels and panels falling off and whistleblowers being murdered. Yeah. Has anyone else been watching the different Palestinian resistance group videos? It's pretty incredible seeing the guerrilla warfare they're using to fight back against the IOF with. I haven't. What are you watching for that? Do you have recommendations? I hope everyone is staying safe. I'm still recovering from pneumonia. Protect your lungs, absolutely. You know, wearing an N95 or better mask. And there's other things that are comparable to N95s, like KN95s, or, I mean, there's N99s, which are better. FFP2, FFP3 is, I think, the European standard. So there's different things that filter to a very high degree the stuff going into your lungs. I got a DM popping up. What is this about? So yeah, wearing a very good mask, it will definitely help keep you from getting sick. I mean, I don't know how many people I've heard from, and me too. I haven't really been sick with anything for years now because I've been masking consistently. So, you know, it works. Someone brought up the failed attempt at revolution in the Weimar Republic in Germany recently, and I hate thinking about what could have been because it breaks my heart. Well, and that goes into the Browder text that was just posted for the weekend about social fascism. I mean, that was one of the main examples that Browder used. He talked about the U.S. Socialist Party, led by Norman Thomas, talked about social democracy in Germany and how it helped pave the way for the Nazis, and also the MacDonald Labour government in the UK. All good examples of how the reformists, being anti-communist, helped pave the way for fascism as capitalism goes into crisis and they become part of the administration of capitalism. We got Nazism scattered across the globe instead of a wave of communism in Western Europe. And I think that this is also something I was getting into in the comments at the beginning of that Browder piece about the thesis of social fascism versus united fronts versus popular fronts. It's different approaches to the problem of opportunism and reformism. So you have, like, in 1917, the Bolsheviks split off, renamed, which had been split off, renamed as the Communist Party, as a way to distance themselves from the Socialist International and the social democracy that had endorsed World War I. So that split between what we would today consider social democrats, reformists, as in mere reformists, because remember, communists do advocate for reforms, but we don't limit it to that, whereas reformism is anti-revolution in the sense of mere reformism. So after that split, there was this question of what do communists do with the social democracy. And so we have the formula that when bourgeois ideas enter the communist movement or the vanguard, that we call that revisionism. So it's revising Marx with bourgeois ideas. Marxism is the, obviously it's a set of tools for historical analysis using dialectical materialism, which in that application we call historical materialism. But beyond that, it is the revolutionary ideology of liberation for the proletariat. So it's revolutionary proletarian ideology and analytical tools. When bourgeois ideas come in and start knocking out some of those proletarian ideas, it's revisionism. When bourgeois ideas enter the workers' movement, that is social democracy. So, and there's a relationship between those things there as well. But anyway, this question of how to deal with that, of treating it as just social fascism, describing it as such, is one thing. I think that that's an important thing to revive, actually, and bring that back. The idea that there should be united fronts among all proletarian elements, communist and non-communist, is the united front idea. And again, part of that is engaging with the non-communist elements to try to show why not being communist isn't as good as being communist. And then there's the popular front, where you're working with not just proletarian non-communist elements, but non-proletarian elements, petty bourgeois and bourgeois, quote, anti-fascists. So arguably, the popular front idea embodies a certain kind of opportunism that might be called for in certain circumstances, like if the proletariat is very weak and unable, but I mean, this was more the case like over a century ago. And then talking about, we didn't get a wave of communism in Western Europe. What was the role of the Popular Front thesis and the Popular Front tactic in the lack of a wave of communism in Western Europe? And so there was a very interesting book, Flashy pointed out to me recently, by a Portuguese communist called Anti-Dimitrov. Georgi Dimitrov was the head of the Comintern at the time of the Popular Front tactic. And did this override more of a proletarian drive for revolution in the name of sort of working with the, quote, anti-fascist bourgeoisie during World War II and the run-up to World War II. That's something I would like to explore a lot more in terms of trying to figure out, what were the major mistakes that put these projects off course, and that may have been one of them. It's a very interesting appendix on the Stalin years of the USSR as well at the end of that I was reading recently. The Nepmen, NEP, were little engines of petty bourgeois class consciousness in the USSR. Fucking Nepmen, shaking my head. Yeah, that was one of the main theses of the thing I was reading in the appendix of Anti-Dimitrov, which to me, it kind of cut through the Stalin, Trotsky, Bukharin stuff in a way I had not seen done before and made a lot of sense to me. So I'll be returning to that. Usually dollar stores are the harbingers of the final stage of economic decay in a neighborhood. If they're closing up and moving out, then there's really not much value left to extract from those communities. I mean, to put it another way, if you can't afford to shop at the dollar store, yeah, hard times are definitely have arrived. So, is Freedom Road Socialist Organization a good organization? I don't really know enough about them to say one way or the other. Maybe people in the chat can comment on that. I used to work at a Dollar General, never more than 2 people at a time. It was dangerous. We had a whole routine in case we had a burglar. I've definitely worked retail where we had, the store had been robbed a number of times, so there was a routine for that as well, yeah. Oh, yeah, and then talking about, I have been linking Status Quo on what used to be the Channels tab. Is that true that the Channels tab doesn't show up anymore? It just shows up at the bottom of the homepage on YouTube. I forgot to double check that. I'm loading it now just to look. Yeah, they don't even do the Channels tab. That really sucks. Anyway, Status Quo is an independent journalist outlet that I've really appreciated some of their coverage of, like, the Flint water crisis and the East Palestine bomb train disaster, and they've covered COVID. But yeah, starting a petition for them to start covering COVID better again. So there's a link there in the chat. I'll take a look at that. Thanks. Call it what it is. Next was murdered. Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, we'll probably be covering that more in the next stream, including the whole Taylor Lorenz thing of interviewing the libs of TikTok people and platforming them and all that kind of stuff. I was involved in some pushback on Taylor Lorenz directly, and yeah, that was a frustrating time. I listened to a Latvian communist on a podcast talking about post-World War II Latvia, how there were local Nazi collaborators who continued killing people until the government caught all of them. Anyway, Khrushchev, during the de-Stalinization, freed most of them, and they moved strategy co-opting the communist movement with their nationalism. Well, that all sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Yeah, if you have a link, I'd be interested in listening to that, actually. So let me put it this way. After 4 years of this and doing more anti-revisionist, explicitly anti-revisionist content, because, like, obviously Lenin was anti-revisionist, right? I mean, he wrote a lot of stuff against Bernstein, and that was all kind of baked in. But after Lenin, it was this thing of, like, you know, had this really trailblazer of analysis that no longer was kind of providing really clear insights. Not that the rest of us can't think for ourselves, but that was a really clear, focused political movement that was just making major gains. Anyway, afterwards, yeah, so there's the NEP, and the petty bourgeoisie start becoming, rather than what was Lenin has sort of expected. If you read, like, the Tax in Kind, which we've done on the channel, he thought that the NEP, where they were allowing small amounts of capitalism, rather than letting that go on for a few decades and then, you know, having it come to an end and socializing that stuff, within just a few years, the NEP petty bourgeoisie was getting really rowdy. And so in the late 20s, the Soviets had to pull the plug, although there were different strategies about what to do about that. Stalin obviously moved forward with forcibly collectivizing stuff a lot sooner because it became apparent that the longer they let that go on, they were becoming a really truculent counter-revolutionary force. So it was like, we can't let this fire spread anymore. And obviously, everybody's heard the stories about the kulaks, killing livestock, burning grain, burying gold, literally doing the if I can't have it, no one will thing. And good, the government got rid of that. Bukharin and Trotsky had different ideas about what to do with that. And the government under Stalin, which rallied the support, they got the best idea anybody could think of and moved forward with it. But I think it was a real blow to socialism in the USSR. Not that it was a mistake that everyone could have seen coming, but regardless, it was a real setback because the petty bourgeoisie wound up being, one of the main obstacles at that point. And they kind of had to have, after World War I and after the Civil War, they wound up having to have another struggle against the petty bourgeoisie really soon afterwards. So I think that analyzing more of what happened there and how it transformed the state, because the state had to transform itself in order to deal with that. And it may have been, they managed to keep control and to keep building socialism, but I think at a big cost. And I think it's interesting to look back at how that in some ways weakened the project. Even though it was outwardly, it remained strong, and the socialization continued, and so they kept building socialism, but the kind of scar that it left on the party, a lot of the opposition moved to the right, had some long-lasting effects that may have helped set up Khrushchev, and then as you have this example of the Latvian Nazis. So I think it poked some holes in the Soviet government. Even though the USSR was able to continue, there were some pretty deep wounds, I think, inflicted at that point. So interesting stuff that I definitely want to get into more. When I can put together a playlist on that, I will. I love that the thumbnail for this playing in the background is a huge hammer and sickle. Whenever my coworkers or our leadership come in to ask me a question, I don't even try to hide it anymore. Well, do what you think is safe, but yeah. Has anyone else heard of the Free Alabama movement? I have not. I went deep into rural Alabama to protest a prison being built and to show solidarity with the striking prison workers. Interesting. No. So that is a positive thing rather than a reactionary thing. You never know. When you hear like Free Alabama, it could be like free it from the liberal government or whatever. But I'll take a look at that unless you have a link. Anytime somebody asks me, hey, what are your thoughts on blah, 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 I kind of hate that framing of like, can you ask me like a more specific question than what are your thoughts on blah, blah, blah? Ask me something more specific. What are you wondering about it? Ask me that question. But it's always helpful. I may not have heard of whatever it is you're talking about. Send me a link. That's always helpful. And I'm not trying to single you out, Kim Jong. That's just reminded me of that. And you weren't even really doing that. So just reminded me of that. Have y'all seen how the ACLU is suing to effectively gut the NLRA? Yeah, we're going to be covering that later, actually. Not wearing a mask is a very real material form of ableism, and ableism isn't compatible with anarchism. Absolutely. Yeah, or to put it another way, wearing a mask is anti-fascism. So I would agree with that. I'm so glad my phone gave me a notice on the stream. There you go. Yeah, it seems like a lot of people have found their way to the stream. We got about 60 people in here. In my country, we recently had an outbreak of pertussis or whooping cough, and we have like 150 children hospitalized, and many parents didn't take their kids to get vaccinated. The anti-vax fascist movement and its consequences. The government only recently put measures not to allow unvaccinated children in daycare and school. That's terrible. Yeah, I mean, that is a disease that you don't see that much in the U.S., for example. It used to be more of an issue, but you can definitely... I mean, We're at a point now. So, sort of brief public health overview. Used to be that infectious disease was a lot more of the problem, and then a lot of effective tools were brought out to combat infectious disease. And then we hit a point where it was more chronic disease or like lifestyle disease that became more of the issue. Heart disease, obesity, other stuff like that. So it's like all the progress gets lost, basically, except that we have the historical record of, how to fight and win, how to defeat these things. But it's just being fucking ignored, and they're coming back. How am I doing? I'm actually doing pretty good today. John Elmer with the Electronic Intifada is the go-to for military analysis in Palestine. Yes, I was talking about if there were any more specific streams beyond that, but I did want to actually, I had a note in the show notes today to give a shout out to Electronic Intifada, INTIFADA, if people want to follow more of what's going on with the resistance in Palestine. A commenter suggested that, and I agree. So yeah, if you want to see more of that, as the commenter put it, Mondo Weiss and Middle East Eye, they do a lot of the humanitarian stuff. They cover that very well. Democracy Now! Also daily covering the humanitarian outrages, the crisis going on, as consequence of Israel's genocide in Gaza, and now also expanding into the West Bank increasingly. But they don't necessarily cover the resistance as much. Electronic Intifada is a good place for that. So the Al-Qassam Brigades has a Telegram channel where they post all of their videos. Okay. I'm not really on Telegram right now, but good to know. Also, Resistance News Network on Telegram. Okay. Also, Al Jazeera Arabic or El Arabi on YouTube for the resistance vids. The time for a popular front has long passed, especially within the West. Indeed, and arguably may have even passed by the 30s, but the bourgeoisie are way too concentrated. Popular front in these conditions is just capitulation. I agree. I mean, that was also floated as a strategy for like Spain at the time, where the proletariat, they were a bit behind in terms of industrialization, so the proletariat wasn't as big, and so on. There's, in the 21st century, really no excuse, though. Anarchists tend to criticize the Spanish Republic and the communists for pushing a popular front. Oh yeah, that's the exact example I was just using. It's like, bruh, the Spanish Republic was outnumbered and outgunned as it was. How would it have fared with fewer allies and more enemies? Well, utopianism, idealism, and its consequences, I think, is what you're looking at there. It's just you have the idea of what should be done without looking at what are the resources in front of you that you can actually work with. I remember Hoxha talking about his popular front in the partisan revolution against Nazi fascism within the works in Palestine and comparing their demographic of struggle. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Albania was in a completely different state of development of, say, like Germany at the time. And they were able to build socialism after that. Coming out of the morale boost of national liberation, Albania had been really severely oppressed by a whole chain of different oppressive powers. And to win national liberation, fend off the Nazi invasion, and, the peasantry, that combined with the skill of the leadership of the Party of Labor of Albania, they were able to bring everyone into the process of building socialism successfully, and it's a good example of that. Someone says, Freedom Road, FRSO is all right, but join a bigger party instead. All right, there's a piece of feedback there. Taylor Lorenz is a trust fund baby. I mean, she's a complete opportunist in the non-Marxist sense of the word, just literally going after any opportunity to, like, promote her brand. And like I said, we'll cover that in more detail probably in the next stream or the one after. Okay, the one with the Latvian communist. The podcast is called Actual Existing Socialism and Iskolat, pre-World War II and post-World War II, separate episodes. I think we're catching up to the end of the chat here, which is good, so I can start the articles for today. Drama will consume you. I don't think it's good for mental health. No, and you don't really learn anything either. It's just fucking conflict. Drama is so useless. Drama is the whole reason why I left certain sites. Life is too precious to waste it on drama. When, as I've said before, I don't really listen to many other communist channels at this point. My focus right now is on doing the reading and doing my own content and talking to you all and reading the things that you send in, and because I actually know some of you. And when I'm not doing that, I'm looking more at bourgeois, more petty bourgeois, like not, CNN and CNBC, but I'm looking more at bourgeois economic analysis because I think that we're entering another 2008 type event, and I'm trying to be riding that wave as it comes in. Like, imagine you could go back, which I mean, some people were, but for me, it's like, imagine you could go back to 06 and 07 and watch the entire 2008 crash develop in real time, day by day. I feel like I'm actually getting that opportunity now. This started for me by following the housing market because, we've done part of, I gotta resume this at some point, part of the homeless industrial complex playlist and talking about the housing crisis. So I started looking more and more at the housing market, like what's going on there. So I started listening to economics channels, different economists who analyze the housing market. And turns out, I've covered this in a number of other streams, but let me put up what is increasingly, I think if I had to say my favorite image, if I had to pick a single image that was my favorite, it would be this one. This is from a channel, Reventure Consulting, which you got to take all of the, housing market analysis channels with a grain of salt. Most of them have terrible petty bourgeois, extremely reactionary, basically fascist, libertarian politics. I think Reventure has some of the least bad politics, and at least they don't rub it in your face, and they do talk about people trying to buy houses rather than just investors. A lot of those like investment things, they're literally small investors are a lot of what's causing the problem in housing. But anyway, this is from Reventure Consulting from a video. The biggest mortgage collapse in U.S. history is happening right now, meaning there's the lowest number of mortgage applications. Mortgages are how most people fund house purchases. It's a loan that is specific to buying a house. So there's the least amount of mortgages being applied for in history. Why? Well, there is the 130-year average going back to 1890 of U.S. house prices. You can see that up to about 2000 or the 90s, there was a pretty steady range. It was compressed within a certain range. And then you start to get around 1980, you see like a historically high spike that's as high as anything, back for 100 years, basically. And so this is the end of the superinflation of the 70s and the beginning, really, politically, of neoliberalism, which was largely a response to that global crisis of capitalism. Then around 1990 and the George H.W. Bush recession, there's another spike which actually sets a new record. Then it comes down for a while, and then the next thing, it just blows everything else out of the water. And reminder, this is adjusted for inflation. It's an inflation-adjusted chart. So you get this spike that peaks in like 06, 07, and that is what laid the groundwork for the 2008 crash. There was so much value, and there was so many other investments and bets tied up in the housing market, mortgage-backed securities and derivatives. And when that crashed and it fell back a lot closer to the 130-year average, which is what it's always going to do. Capitalism moves cyclically. It's not full of tons of surprises. Capitalism is a fairly predictable system. And predictably, in 09, 10, 11, 12, there was a trough in prices, and then it just started climbing right back up. And as you can see, we're coming down from another all-time high. Canada's housing bubble is even worse than the US's right now. We're seeing similar things in like Germany and the UK. But when this pops, and it looks like it's starting to, the roller coaster has just gone over the top of that initial hill that it climbs slowly. And it hasn't really started soaring downwards yet, but when it does, hold on to your hats, because I think it's going to get real fucking messy. And then politically, what does this mean? Well, actually, I had a comment. Let me go dig up the comment in the YouTube comments. Somebody was just asking about this in relation to the Earl Browder piece. So in response to the meaning of social fascism, somebody asked, "This is so damn interesting and seems so applicable to our modern situation." And by the way, the reason for that is it's still imperialism. Like, it's still capitalism. We're still in the same basic historical period. And these things aren't going to change. The fundamental class interests and the fundamental dynamics aren't going to change without a revolution until this system is ended. So yeah, it's obviously, like, that's the reason why it's so applicable to our current situation. And you see that sometimes with comments where people will be like, whoa, Lenin was a time traveler, because what he was describing in the 19 teens, it's like the same situation. And I would say, no, he's not a time traveler. Like, I mean, your insight is correct. It's the same situation. But it's not because Lenin's a time traveler. It's because we're still in the same historical moment. In other words, he didn't travel time because no time has passed in the historical sense. We're still in that same moment. So that's why it's so applicable. Anyway, thank you for giving me something so stimulating to listen to while closing at my job, which is mind-numbing. I've got a question, though. At one point, Browder says that fascist movements are a direct reaction to militant labor movements, and that without a strong working class movement, capitalism doesn't need fascism to preserve itself. To me, this makes a lot of inherent sense, because, yeah, Browder was responding to the socialist reformists that were saying, like, well, the communists insist on violent revolution, and that this just provokes people, the more timid, to run into the arms of fascists. And it's like, well, are people not supposed to, defend themselves? Should people just start loving their exploitation, or how does that work? But of course, the socialists think you can just wait out capitalism, it'll be fine. And that's the problem with reformism, which is basically a version of bourgeois thought, or at least the heavy corruption of Marxist thought with bourgeois thought, to the point that it, arguably bears more in common with bourgeois thought than proletarian thought. Certainly there isn't much of a militant labor movement in the US, but we've still got this MAGA movement on the rise, which seems fascistic in nature. So a couple of things that I said in response. First of all, to some extent, it never really went away. They always kept fascism on the back burner for as soon as it seemed like capitalism got into, any more distress and any more trouble. But 2008 really got them edgy. They created the Tea Party right after that, like literally right after 2008. I think that formative Tea Party speech, which was aired on Fox News, I forget who gave it, that was in like December or November of 2008. They created the Tea Party to start astroturfing a movement to capture public outrage and steer it into a useful direction. So Lulbertarianism, Rand Paul, etc. MAGA is a direct descendant of the Tea Party. So, and I mean, Tea Party coming up in 2008, then you get like the birther thing in like by 2012. Tea Party, by the way, shed any actually critical, I was looking at conspiracy stuff at that time. After the Tea Party came out, I was like, oh, fuck this, because it was like a complete dumbing down of some actually critical research on U.S. empire and things like that. That was where it became, they took the elements out of that would still attract some of the, the right-wing people who would be more amenable to fascism, real reactionaries, while taking out anything of any real substance. It went on from there. 2012, Trump comes in with the birther thing, and then MAGA. Like, that's all one direct lineage. And even before the Tea Party, you had like the Minutemen in 2006 under Bush and Cheney, and so on. But anyway, meanwhile, while the right wing has been building that AstroTurf stuff, we've also seen Occupy and similar things popping up in the wake of 2008 on the left. So people talking about capitalism again, which for the U.S. was literally a step forward. DSA growing, the Bernie Sanders campaign, and the stirrings of a labor revival, which hasn't made major strides yet, but it is happening. You're right that it isn't really roaring, but after the next crash, which I think that we're on the cusp of, all of this is going to get more escalated. So we saw the right wing really step it up after 2008 because that was a time of vulnerability for capitalism. They're going to enter another really vulnerable period, and they're going to trot out even more escalated fascist politics after that. Yeah, so basically they're doing a hard push for whatever additional profits they can get. This goes back to the 90s and 2000s, which was the beginnings of some of this instability. You know, like I said, going back to the 70s crisis with the inflation, they brought out neoliberalism after that. It was the beginning of making workers pay for the crisis by rolling back all the programs. And then that has just gotten more escalated as we got into the 90s and the 2000s. And the 2000s really stepped it up with the war on terror. Honestly, people talking about Trump like he came out of a vacuum or something. No, I mean, honestly, Bush and Cheney should be talked about way more. But people they can't bring themselves to reflect on 2001 to 2009 almost at all. But arguably way more transformative time than anything Trump did. Was engaging in a discussion about that recently, where, I mean, Bush and Cheney, that whole administration, they made Trump look like a complete amateur. But yet no one talks about it, and that really needs to come back. So they're doing a hard push for whatever additional profits they can get. Capitalism, now imperialism, the final stage of capitalism, it has no more progress to offer humanity. It is just going to grub profits more and more aggressively. And so the push is on to roll back whatever social reforms that they can, again, make workers pay for the crisis, and so on. But you see here, the housing bubble, this is, you know, the activity of investors that don't necessarily trust the stock market or whatever else, and they're just going out there and buying everything up, and then sitting on it and driving up the value, and people can't access the housing. And it's causing these gigantic price spikes, which in some regions are starting to pop already. On the coasts, not as much, but in Texas up north of that, you know, the sort of middle column of the U.S., there is, it's starting to pop. In Florida also, you see starting to pop, more and more price declines. It hasn't really hit landslide proportions yet, but when it does, expect the politics to just get worse and worse and worse. And like I said, that's what I'm focusing on a lot more right now than sort of minutia of like what happened in a national liberation struggle, you know, in the 60s in this particular country. I think that there is a tsunami about to hit people in the face with another round of the global financial crisis. And it's not that that other stuff isn't important at all, but I think to me this is what's most relevant. I don't really see many people on the left covering it at all. So that's what I've been spending a lot of time on lately. Oh, interesting. About the Spanish Republic. Fun fact, well, fun and with a question mark, about the Spanish Republic. The colonized Moroccans sued the Spanish Republic for independence under favorable terms for the Spanish, but the Spanish rejected this proposal. Moroccan independence would likely have cut off a major supply of troops, the Regulares, to Franco's forces, and it could have turned the tide of the Spanish Civil War. That's really interesting, and I would love to read more about that. I'm making a note of it, but do you have a link to a resource on that? That would be very interesting. The problem with the real estate crash is that prices will fall like 30% and spike up again unless the United States becomes like Japan, going in a deflationary spiral. There's a lot of signs that that is entirely possible. There's also a gigantic wave of new construction that was just done, and it is regional, but I have a feeling combined with other forces that this is the beginning of the end. Also, you look at that housing chart, it tends to be a big spike and a big crash. And I think that is historically the trend. If it were to just drop slightly and then keep resuming, that would really be ahistorical. So it would be, you know, unprecedented. So I would expect a bigger crash, actually, considering the instability of the financial and banking system. So there was another thing. There was an emergency Fed program that just closed, I think on the 15th. Let me get the name. I think it was the BFTP. Federal Reserve Board announces the Bank Term Funding Program would end as scheduled in March. Yeah, so it's March 11. The Bank Term Funding Program ended. This means that banks have to go back to the discount window, which the Fed wants them to do to get money. but that's typically viewed by other banks and investors as a sign of weakness. But the Fed really doesn't want to keep doing these emergency programs, and they're like, go back to the discount window. But in the final hours of the program, the BTFP got hit with like record demand. People like, I think it was almost like $3.5 billion loaned out in like the final day of the program, because the financial institutions just don't want to go to the discount window. Now they have to, because that program has been closed for about a week. And we may start to see more of the shit hitting the fan. And I think it's going to be one thing after another as smaller investors have to sell off their investments. That's going to drive, they need cash if whatever else that they were involved in goes belly up. Then they have to sell off their real estate portfolio to get cash. Dumping those properties back onto the market is going to drive down prices, and away we go. So I think that there's a lot of things brewing there. That combined with people need housing, okay? And the system obviously decided that a certain amount of homelessness is something that is just a new feature of the system under neoliberalism. Prior to that, homelessness as we know it today didn't really exist. But that became a new standard feature of the system under neoliberalism, just as unemployment is a standard feature of capitalism. Now they're upping it where a certain amount of people aren't even going to get housing. So there's a certain amount of that the system can bear, and as long as the system can bear it, the capitalists will just roll, because it's all about profits. Like human rights are sort of an afterthought. Icing on the cake, if you can manage it, then you can sort of get into like, measuring contest with other capitalist powers of like, oh, well, we only have 1% homelessness. Oh, yeah? Well, you're so bad. You have 1.5%. And it's like, why do you have fucking any homelessness? But anyway, the system has decided that in neoliberalism, a certain amount of homelessness is just what they're going to, have to do to squeeze the working class harder. And bottom line, though, people need housing. And at a certain point, this creates undesirable instability for capital. And so the prices have to come down as consumers get squeezed more and more and can't afford the housing. The prices have to come down. They have to come down. They'll squeeze you for as long as they can, but at a certain point, the prices have to come back down again. And again, we already see the beginning of the tipping point on this housing cycle. I'd be surprised if it went back up, but even if it goes back up short term, they're just forestalling the inevitable, and it'll just be a bigger crash later. It has to come down again. Like, this is just what we know about capitalism. What goes up must come down. It's just the way it works. Capitalism overcomes its limits in certain ways, but it's fundamentally incapable of resolving the contradictions that it faces. With that in mind, it should come as no surprise that we appear to be in a time loop as history repeats itself. I mean, we're just seeing, again, we're in the same basic time period. It's just that certain things recur within that period of time as a feature of that time period. Reagan was the first movie star U.S. president. Trump was the first reality TV star president. We're probably only a decade away from the first U.S. president who was a streamer. There you go. Let's hope it collapses before that happens. I think, wasn't RFK Jr. chatting up like a football star and somebody else recently as far as being like a vice president? Do I think that there's any way to utilize AI in the revolutionary struggle? I think there's a lot more basic things that are way more important. But yeah, we've covered Stalinbot, which is available in the Red Alexandria Discord server, which is findable just by searching on Red Alexandria Discord server. In creating Stalinbot, what they did was they took GPT-4 and they told it to just search the works of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and a few other people. And so it gives you really high-quality answers to anything. In the end, though, all this can do is offer some advice. I mean, you've still got to do the mass work and everything, and the agitation and all of that. So, I mean, that is really the main thing that needs to happen. Is there any hope for the in-development nasal COVID vaccines getting us back to a place where we can unmask? I think that theoretically, yes, there is. However, from what I've seen, the progress on the nasal COVID vaccines does not really seem to be moving forward. And why would it? Because basically, you've got major public health institutions the world over declaring that COVID is no big deal. So why would anyone push for a nasal vaccine that nobody's going to get? You know, I mean, it could come out and it could be useful enough that it creates sterilizing immunity in the respiratory tract. So, like, in other words, immunity to the point where if a viral particle lands in your sinuses, that your mucous membranes are already primed to just delete it on the spot. So that's the kind of immunity that you would need. And unfortunately, the shots, I think that there was some talk that the Novavax vaccine was able to do sterilizing immunity, but that was prior to the XBB mutation. So, for some time now, it hasn't been able to do that, is my understanding. So I don't know. I mean, will there be a nasal COVID vaccine? I will definitely get it if there is. But so far, I mean, it was like the Department of Defense at the Walter Reed Hospital was working on some kind of super vaccine that was supposed to basically train your immune system against 24 different kinds of spike protein variants at once. This was like big news back in 2020 or 2021, and then just nothing. Why? Because why would you develop a vaccine for something that's been declared not really a big deal? So there you go. So now that we've caught up with the chat, wanted to cover a few things from the last stream and just some comments that have come in. First of all, there was a part in the most recent stream, Livestream 112, where I did a little bit about fast food work not being hard. I was doing a funny voice in that. Maybe it wasn't exaggerated enough for a few people. I had a few questions like, were you serious? Do you really think that fast food work isn't real work? No. Again, I guess the funny voice wasn't exaggerated enough for a few people, but I got 2 or 3 comments like, I can't believe that you don't think, you just decided that fast food work isn't real work. I was just like, are you fucking kidding me? Anyway. Just chill on the outrage for a second. Anyway, what else? Let's go into some other questions that people asked. So I got a question related to the slogan that I have on the channel, which is intensify class struggle. So someone asked, hi S4A, this is beside the topic of the video, but I have a question regarding the, quote, intensification of class struggle. Could you explain what exactly that means or link to an explanation? During the live stream, you said something like, we should welcome, struggle for, and use every right handed down to the proletariat, even under capitalism, like unions. I mean, whether or not you have legal union rights, you should still form unions. Demonstration rights, human rights. Does this include pushing for taxing companies and rich people as to intensify class struggle and eventually transition to socialism and get rid of capital accumulation? So my answer to this question went as follows. So I said, regarding the intensification of class struggle, it means that proletarians need to agitate, educate, and organize for class struggle against the capitalists more and more intensely. There's not really anything else to it. It's a general slogan, but here are a couple of examples from readings. So the first one from Charu Majumdar, a Indian Maoist. Even congressmen would not have dared plead on behalf of the feudal classes so unashamedly. Therefore, obeying the instructions of the party leaders would mean blindly accepting the feudal classes' exploitation and rule. This was criticizing another party that was kind of sucking up to the feudal classes. So the responsibility of the communists is to expose the anti-class and reactionary role of this leadership to party members and the people, to hold on to the principle of intensifying class struggle and march ahead. Another example from Shibdas Ghosh. Naturally, when after the socialist revolution it was necessary to further intensify class struggle, when the practice of proletarian culture ought to have been further heightened, when it was indispensable to keep uninterrupted this practice and the process of struggle in order to uplift the standard of proletarian revolutionary character against the infiltration of the influence of bourgeois ideology and culture into the party and the social life, when it was necessary to hold aloft the banner of cultural revolution in order to raise the cultural and political standard of the people to conform to the needs of each and every change of the character of the socialist productive system. Long phrases here. The fact that this struggle got slackened due to the self-complacent attitude of the Soviet leadership after attainment of some stability in the social system following revolution actually led to this inevitable fall of political and cultural standards and provided the breeding ground for revisionism. So a couple of examples there on intensifying class struggle. And as I concluded, you also asked, does this include pushing for taxing companies and rich people and to eventually transition to socialism and get rid of capital accumulation? And I responded, you should understand that we do not, quote, eventually transition to socialism straight out of capitalist reforms or regulations. It requires a revolution. Definitely revisit Rosa Luxemburg's Reform or Revolution on this. It's essential. We have it on the channel, and I provided a link. Taxation is not necessarily part of a revolutionary movement's platform unless it meets specific tactical goals for that movement in those conditions. When we talk about intensifying class struggle, what we are more concerned with is, one, agitating workers to bring out their grievances and demands and to sharpen these grievances in the workers' minds rather than letting them lie. In other words, you want to encourage people to think about their complaints and to have them in the front of their mind rather than ignoring them. Because people can have complaints that they let fall to the back of their mind and, they don't act on them. But that's not what we want. We want to bring it out. That's, agitation. And actually, education, the next step, means to draw out, literally. So you educate workers on the systemic historical factors that are causing their exploitation and oppression, which is the basis of their grievances, and explain that, what their historical tasks are as a class to bring about an end to it. Okay, so that's the education part. So like A, you have this grievance. B, here's how this grievance is tied into capitalism. And here are what your historic tasks are to end that. And then C, organize workers to fight to do those tasks and to build class consciousness, discipline, and militancy in the process of that struggle. The main proletarian organizations are labor unions. That is the overall main site of the struggle. There also needs to be a proletarian political party that can advise and direct the proletariat using historical materialist analysis. Remember that politics is the concentrated essence of economics, so the class interests that exist within economic contradictions, those get expressed through political parties, so political parties have a class nature, and so on. So anyway, some thoughts on the slogan that you'll see. This actually just came out of back when I was using Twitter, and the handle was socialism for all /S4A. That had extra characters, and people put different things, kind of like a bumper sticker, vanity plates, whatever, in the rest of their Twitter handle. So I just filled out the rest of the characters that were at my disposal with what would I like people to read every time they see my posts: intensify class struggle. And then I transferred it everywhere else because I kind of liked it, actually, and I still do. So that's intensify class struggle. All right, what's next? Oh, question about Russian imperialism. So we had another question about, I mentioned in one of the streams, Lenin talking about Russia being imperialist in his time. Therefore, it would be absurd to think Russia is not imperialist at this time. So the question was, you are a solid authority on this kind of thing now, up there with Finbal Defo, but where did Lenin say that Russia in his time was imperialist? Imperialist because it was an empire in that sense, or that capitalism had reached its highest stage? So this was my answer to that question. Lenin showed that World War I was an inter-imperialist war, and Russia was a major party in it. Capitalism was still developing out of the fetters of Tsarism in Russia at that time, but Russia already was hooked into the imperialist system by then by all kinds of investments. It was particularly bound to French capital, and it was rapidly conforming to that system as described in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Quote, thus, owing to the formation of capitalist monopolies, the merging of bank and industrial capital has also made enormous strides in Russia. So that merging of bank and industrial capital is known as the emergence of finance capital. That is one of the characteristics, and so there's Lenin describing Russia already at that time, although its capitalism, it was still emerging out of the sort of remnants of feudalism, already by that time an overthrown feudalism, which technically most of the main features of Russian feudalism were ended in the 1860s, but parts of it still went on, and there was still the Tsarist system and so on. But capitalism, and even advanced capitalism, was coming up quickly by that time, and there was one feature. So Lenin also listed Russia in that book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, as among the 6, quote, great powers that were engaging in redivision of the world in their capitalist imperialist conquests. These were the UK, the USA, France, Germany, Japan, and Russia. Quote, however strong the process of leveling the world, of leveling the economic and living conditions in different countries, may have been in the past decades as a result of the pressure of large-scale industry, exchange, and finance capital, considerable differences still remain. So talking about differences between the countries, even though there have been some equalizing forces, there's still significant differences. And among the 6 countries mentioned, we see firstly young capitalist countries, America, Germany, and Japan, whose progress has been extraordinarily rapid. Secondly, the second group is countries with an old capitalist development, France and the UK, whose progress lately has been much slower than that of the 3 previously mentioned countries. And then thirdly, a country most backward economically, Russia, where modern capitalist imperialism is enmeshed, so to speak, in a particularly close network of pre-capitalist relations, unquote. So anyway, there you have a contrast of the different characteristics of the great powers that were showing the characteristics of imperialism. They weren't all the same, but there were a few types. So, moving on to the next page. Regarding the rapidly changing state of capitalism at the time, so talking about the emergence of imperialism, the final stage of capitalism, out of the earlier stage of capitalism, non-imperialism. Actually, this is a terrible name for it. But the earlier stage of capitalism, which was not imperialist, the ascendant capitalism that was more progressive in its nature. Progressive in the sense it was overthrowing feudalism and transforming society. However, by the time it gets to imperialism, that's the end stage. Anyway, Lenin wrote, quote, we ask, is it conceivable, assuming that the capitalist system remains intact, and this is precisely the assumption that Kautsky does make, that such alliances would be more than temporary, that they would eliminate friction, conflict, and struggle in every possible form. So, talking here about Kautsky's theory of, quote, ultra-imperialism, where imperialism becomes peaceful. This is because the only conceivable basis under capitalism for the division of spheres of influence, interests, colonies, etc., is a calculation of the strength of those participating, their general economic, financial, military strength, etc. And the strength of these participants in the division of the world does not change to an equal degree, for the even development of different undertakings, trusts, branches of industry, or countries is impossible under capitalism. Half a century ago, Germany was a miserable, insignificant country if her capitalist strength is compared with that of the Britain of that time, half a century ago. Japan compared with Russia in the same way. Is it conceivable that in 10 or 20 years' time, the relative strength of the imperialist powers will have remained unchanged? It's out of the question. So Lenin is saying here that because capitalism engages in this competition in terms of inter-imperialist contradictions and inter-imperialist competition, they're constantly shifting in power because they're all trying to get a bigger cut. So yeah, he's saying, will all of these countries exist in the same balance 10 or 20 years from now? It's out of the question. They're all competing with each other and shifting. So Russia may have been the most backward at that time, but would it still be in 10 or 20 years? We would have a different situation. Not necessarily that Russia would be at the head of the pack, but we can be assured that it would be something different. If Russia was among, oh, and then, so that's the end of the Lenin quote. If Russia was among the group of emerging imperialist powers at the time of World War I, when they were having their first inter-imperialist war, then definitely after almost a century of higher level socialist development, would we assume that Russia's level of development was one of advanced monopoly capitalism, which is, Lenin said, if you had to summarize imperialism in a nutshell, it is advanced monopoly capitalism. There are other characteristics, but if you had to just use 3 words, that's the 3 words Lenin would choose, which is what additional modern analysis shows. And I recommended a video by Marxist Paul, Campism, which goes into how modern Russia under Putin, the counter-revolutionary post-USSR Russia, has all of the characteristics of imperialism in the Marxist-Leninist sense. There is the video. Campism, no, Russia is not anti-imperialist. So on a similar topic, somebody asked about Tucker Carlson's interview of Putin. Hello, S4A, this comment is off topic, but I was wondering if you could make a video of a socialist analysis or maybe just a discussion of the Tucker Carlson interview with Putin. By the way, stop calling Tucker like you're on a first name basis with this fuck. Don't do that. Don't do that. It feels like the interview is at an intersection of lots of interesting social issues, such as Republicans warming up to Russia. I mean, the issue that Republicans had with Russia was that it was socialist. It is no longer socialist, therefore there is no barrier to warming up to them today. Geopolitical trends as the economic center of gravity in the world shifts. Nothing new. Capitalist media and the way it invents our reality. I understand if this is a lot to ask, and if you're busy with other projects, all the best, thank you. So with the day that it came out, I thought I would look at that interview and see if I would do some kind of a reaction video. I saw that it was 2 hours, and I couldn't get past the first few minutes of it. Yeah, so I started watching the first few minutes of it. I saw that it was worthless and would be impossible to do anything really with, in my opinion. This was what Seva on Blue Sky made of it. Carlson, what caused the war and why was it NATO? Putin, in 862, the people of Novgorod invited a Varangian prince. Carlson, and what about NATO? Please say NATO. Putin, let us recall Yaroslav the Wise, who once had a dream about a Ukrainian witch. So, I mean, it's just, what can you really do with something like that? I'd be stopping it every 20 seconds, and it was 2 hours long. My video would have been 5 or 6 hours, and no, I did not want to spend 5 or 6 hours on that. So that's why you never saw the S4A Tucker Carlson response, because why even do that? So, COVID. Yeah, it's still here. We are seeing a drop in the COVID level, as is typical this time of year. However, it's really delayed. Also, it is not dropping everywhere. I mean, first of all, still really high levels for this point in time. Actually, if you look at the overall national average at the top of the circulating COVID in the wastewater, it's as high as it was in the pre-winter fall spike. So that's not really great news right there. And then down on the regional chart, it's actually going up in the Midwest. So both the Northeast, the orange line, and the Midwest, the purple line, are very high. They're in like 600 and up. And the Midwest is actually going up. I think it's about 800 right now. That's extremely high. And the worst part is we're in mid-March. You can see it on the top chart that by now the COVID levels usually have come down. But if we switch to the year-over-year view, that's a close-up, and the 2024-2025 line, which starts in March, just because that was where it started being tracked in 2020 originally, you can see that for this time of year, it's way higher than it was in any other year. And actually the last 2 years are a lot higher this time of year than they were in the first 3 years. So is the pandemic, in that sense, getting worse? We may be seeing fewer deaths that are being attributed to COVID, but last year it was the number 3 leading cause of death, and the number 1 and 2 causes, heart disease and cancer, it directly contributes to. I mean, directly or indirectly, depending on how you're measuring that. But I mean, as far as the heart disease, it's directly contributing to damage to the heart and the circulatory system, blood vessels. It causes clotting and things. So, I mean, it's definitely doing damage to the heart and circulatory system. And then as far as the cancer, it also depletes your immune system, really causing a havoc with the T cells, which is one of the main pillars of your immune system, which helps to fight off cancer. So, yeah, I mean, it's definitely strongly in the running, let alone the long COVID, the disability, which I have had long COVID. I still feel at times more or less affected by it. I feel like it's definitely better for me than it was in 2021. Many people aren't so lucky. But yeah, starting off 2024 with a very high, unseasonably high level of COVID. Where it goes from here, we don't know. But basically, the governments have stopped really trying to deal with it at all. So let's follow up on this because actually earlier this month, the CDC dropped their recommendations for isolating from COVID. There we go. CNN Health, CDC drops 5-day isolation guidance for COVID-19, moving away from a key strategy to quell infections. So this was 2.5 weeks ago on March 1st. And can you really call it the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention when they are telling people who have COVID that they do not need to isolate at all, which again was a key strategy for reducing the spread. So reading the article, this is just a snapshot from it. People who test positive for COVID-19 no longer need to routinely stay away from others for at least 5 days, according to new guidelines from the US CDC issued Friday. The change ends a strategy from earlier in the pandemic, the ongoing pandemic, that experts have said was important to controlling the spread of the infection. The agency says that it's updating its recommendations for COVID-19 to bring them in line with its advice for other kinds of respiratory infections, including influenza and RSV. So much for not conflating COVID with the flu, because literally the CDC is now declaring you should treat COVID like the flu. You absolutely shouldn't. But this is the CDC, and they're the loudest voice by far, on the public health landscape. And you got an entire public health system at the state level too, and an entire medical system down to many individual practitioners and healthcare workers who are just complicit in this. But while the main transmission route is the respiratory system for COVID, that's how people catch it, it is not a respiratory illness. I mean, it can infect any kind of tissue that has ACE2 receptors, which does include the lungs, but it can hit many other organs almost as hard as it can hit your lungs, like the heart, liver, pancreas, kidneys, brain, and so on. It can cause, the list of long COVID symptoms is extremely long, and it can include seizures, brain fog, cognitive impairment, all kinds of really serious things. We've seen in children, it increases the odds because of the pancreas damage of developing both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Heart attacks, strokes, blood clots deep vein thrombosis. It goes on and on and on. All kinds of gastrointestinal problems. So it really wreaks havoc in the body, and now they're just saying, oh yeah, you treat it like the flu. Literally, you don't have to isolate, nothing. Offering a single set of unified guidance will make people more likely to follow it, agency experts said. So that's complete capitulation to public resistance and laziness. That's really all that is. It's just capitulation to, the public whined about it, so we're just going to start promoting bad science. We're going to just present things that are against everything that medicine knows about SARS coronavirus 2. Just because, people were complaining. And, we don't want people to complain, so we'll just tell them it's like the flu. That'll be fine. That's literally what the CDC is doing now. Namely, the CDC says that people who have COVID-19 should stay home until they've been fever-free without medication for at least 24 hours, and their symptoms have been improving for 24 hours. After that, it's fine to resume regular activities, agency experts say. So that is upping people's risk of long COVID right there. If you don't do lots of rest, for some time after that, you are upping your odds of developing long COVID by prolonging the infection and the damage that it's doing in the body. But they recommend that people take additional precautions for the next 5 days, including improving ventilation, masking, and limiting close contact with others to lower the risk of spreading it. But if you're downplaying it this much, is anyone going to take that seriously if it inconveniences them? You know? No, of course not. You need much firmer recommendations because it's like if people are going to end up only doing half of what you suggest, if your recommendations are below the minimum of what actually needs to be done, then they're going to wind up doing half of that. This is just common sense. Anyway, these enhanced precautions are particularly important for people who are around vulnerable individuals, such as those who are elderly or have immune function that's been blunted by medication or an illness like cancer. And so they debuted a detailed section on, quote, respiratory virus guidance on its website Wednesday. So this is now the phase of the pandemic that we are in. So have a few more articles here worth mentioning. This is from the New Republic. COVID taught us a lot. The CDC now wants us to forget it. The agency reportedly plans to tell people, this was before March 1st, so I guess they got an early tip that this was going to happen on February 28th. The agency reportedly plans to tell people with COVID and other infections to isolate based on symptoms. Researchers, though, say that symptoms aren't a good indicator of who's contagious. So we'll read a little bit of this. It's a pretty long article, so I won't be able to get to the whole thing. But 4 years after the COVID-19 pandemic slammed into the United States, forcing shutdowns and killing 1.1 million people and counting, I think we're definitely at 1.2 million people. I'm not sure where they got that number from. The U.S. is considering one of the final steps that might cement COVID's status as just another virus, similar to the flu or RSV or HIV, I guess, because both can knock out your immune system, at least in part. Instead of recommending a period of isolation for those who test positive for COVID, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or U.S. Centers for Disease, as I like to call them, because I don't see the control and prevention so much, plan to recommend a symptom-based system, which is what we just read in the other thing, being fever-free for 24 hours and etc. This could be part of broader, quote, pan-respiratory guidance, a topic that CDC Director Mandy Cohen reportedly broached last fall. This is a travesty. I don't know what else to call it. While public appetite for COVID news is low, experts say, and why is that? Because the public's appetite is shaped by the messaging that tells people it's not important. So, like, self-fulfilling prophecy there. Experts say that the stakes for communicating about respiratory illnesses are deceptively high. An ongoing bird flu outbreak and a small but deadly swine flu outbreak in Colombia this year have public health experts worried that another flu pandemic is all but assured in coming years. As government officials downplayed COVID, flu, and other deadly viruses in recent years, shortening COVID isolation times and lifting restrictions, including at the behest of airplane company CEOs, misinformation about measles, another respiratory illness, or again, let's stop just calling it respiratory illness because it can be transmitted that way, but people just think it's something that makes you cough. That's not what it's about. Has proliferated. A massive measles outbreak is currently roiling Europe, and Florida has now reported multiple cases at a single school, which we covered before. The public health system in Florida is just kind of letting that rip. State officials who rose to prominence by opposing COVID measures said that the 200 unvaccinated students who had been exposed didn't need to quarantine. So anyway, I can't go into the rest of this article for time reasons, but I would recommend checking that out if you are interested. So, left to their own devices, what is the public going to do? Well, here's, some insight into that from a study from CIDRAP, the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, I think, at the University of Minnesota. So this is from end of January 2024, a month and a half ago. 3/4 of adults have hidden infectious illness to work, travel, or socialize, surveys suggest. So 3 out of 4 people will just hide in order to, just do what they feel like doing. Up to 75% of adults have concealed an infectious disease from others in order not to miss work, travel, or social events, according to a new study in Psychological Science. The article, by researchers at the University of Michigan, is based on 4 studies and surveys given to 4,110 survey participants. And by the way, that is, as long as they, drew from different demographics, that is representative of the U.S. In statistics, the U.S. may have a very high population of like 330 some million, but you don't actually need that many. You only need a little over 3,000 or so to get an accurate representation, statistically speaking. So over 4,000 is actually very good and representative. All surveys were given after March 2020, when the COVID-19, they wrote COVID-10 pandemic began. And I'm like, COVID-10? What's that? It's a new thing to be on the lookout for. And initial survey participants included 399 university healthcare employees. Only 5% of participants across all studies said that they had concealed a COVID-19 infection. Okay, well, I guess that's a little bit better, that only 1 in 20 specifically concealed COVID. Great, I guess, but still 3 out of 4 were concealing something else in order to just do what they want. 85% of students concealed illness. And of course, there is pressure on people to just go to work anyway, but don't conceal it. Tell the boss, hey, I'm sick, I can't work. If they make you work, they make you work, but at least don't conceal it. And obviously mask and do whatever else. This is also why we need, paid sick leave, and we need to keep placing demands on the system. That needs to march forward, not go into retreat, which is exactly where the Biden administration is leading it by saying, oh, you don't need to rally for COVID protections. COVID's, it's just it's like the flu or RSV. Anyway, in the first study, the researchers surveyed 399 university healthcare employees and 505 students and asked how often they actively covered up symptoms of infectious diseases from others, came to campus or work without telling others that they were feeling ill, or they falsified answers to mandatory symptom screening tools that the university had required for anyone using campus facilities. 85% of students reported concealing a contagious illness, as well as 61% of healthcare workers. So going to the doctor, prepare to get sick. Only 8% of healthcare workers and 3% of students said that they concealed illness due to a university policy requirement. Instead, almost all efforts at hiding were made because of not wanting to miss social engagements, school, or work. Quote, thematic qualitative coding. Coding in qualitative research is where you go through the statements and you try to find trends that you then code with a particular marker, revealed that participants frequently concealed illness because their illness would conflict with other social goals, such as going on a date. Very infrequently, they cited pressure from institutional policies, like lack of paid time off, as a motivation for concealment, the authors wrote. So as I said, paid time off, it's important because then you can knock out some percentage of people doing that due to the missing work. But actually, according to this research, most people were doing it for optional social activities. Transmissibility and symptom severity matter. The second study was conducted on August 1st, 2023, and it asked 946 participants how and when they would consider hiding an infectious illness, but not COVID-19. Participants said that they would consider concealment when the illness was described as being moderately transmissible and as having mild symptoms. But again, this is in 2023. As we get into late 2024 and 2025, and that's the messaging that people hear about COVID, that you don't have to worry about it, would the odds of doing that with COVID go up? I think it stands to reason that they could. A third study of 603 participants showed that illness duration, whether long or short, was not a strong factor in concealment. The fourth study included surveying both healthy and sick participants. The authors found that healthy participants reported being more likely to conceal when the potential harm of their imagined illness was low than when it was high, as did currently sick participants. Quote, currently sick participants reported concealing more than participants who merely imagined being sick, the authors said. The authors said that their findings revealed an insensitivity among most participants. Quote, healthy people forecasted that they would be unlikely to hide harmful illnesses, those that spread easily and have severe symptoms. but actively sick people reported high levels of concealment, regardless of how harmful their illness was to others, said Wilson and Merrill, a doctoral candidate and lead author of the study, in a press release for the Association for Psychological Science, which publishes the journal. So in other words, when people are healthy, they're more likely to say, oh yeah, I would totally not conceal it. I would be, honest about being sick. But then when push came to shove, when people actually were sick, the reality is that they would actually hide it. They were more likely to hide it. So anyway, a little bit of social science there. This kind of comes into another general trend that we've seen in this pandemic. This is from Lee on Blue Sky. Most articles where the author complains about COVID safety boil down to, I love thinking of myself as a compassionate person, and the constant reminders that I am selfish are stressful. This is very true. So it's actually modifying the behavior, actually doing something that might inconvenience you for the sake of not harming someone else, is something a lot of people really seem to struggle with. But if you actually want to think of yourself as compassionate, concerned about public health, not ableist, not helping a disabling virus to spread. This is what we were saying before about, quote, leftists who are not masking and not trying to consider how capitalism has been the main reason in downplaying the harms of the pandemic. You like thinking of yourself that way. You like thinking of yourself as being on the left or compassionate or whatever, but it may not actually align with the reality. Now let's talk about vaccines for a minute. We talk about masking. That is important. There's been so much controversy and so much politicization about vaccines in general in the United States, both masks and vaccines. But in the United States, the vaccines in particular, which vaccines are always kind of like a fascist rallying cry of being anti-vax. But this is a study. COVID vaccination markedly reduced blood clots, heart attacks, heart failure, stroke, and other adverse cardiovascular outcomes, as seen from over 20 million people, about half of whom were vaccinated. And you can see a chart on the screen where your odds of getting these negative health outcomes like blood clots, heart attacks, heart failure, stroke, and other things related to cardiovascular harm, vaccination is going to reduce your odds of all of that. So this anti-vaxxer talking point, which we've covered in the past about myocarditis, is myocarditis a risk from the vaccines? Yes, because it contains the spike protein, or it contains instructions for your body to make the spike protein. Yes, there is some risk of that. There's some risk of taking any kind of medicine. So there is a risk of that because you're letting the spike protein loose in your body, and some people will get a little bit damaged by that in the process of training your immune system. However, as we've seen in other studies before, the odds of getting myocarditis, the heart muscle damage, from an infection is much, much greater than getting it from the vaccine. So you get the vaccine to prime your immune system to fight off the infection more rapidly. Yes, there is some risk of myocarditis from that, particularly in certain populations. It's not equal across all demographics. But your risk from an infection is so much greater. And it has been demonstrated yet again in this population study with 20 million people, half of whom were vaccinated, half of whom were not, roughly, that yes, getting vaccinated is going to reduce your odds of all of those serious things. I mean, do you want blood clots? Do you want strokes? Do you want a heart attack? Do you want heart failure? I don't. I'd like to reduce my odds of that. And as we've seen from the BioBot wastewater charts, which measures the amount of circulating virus, this thing is still circulating. So whether or not you end up in the ER or whatever, you can still end up with serious heart damage and maybe clotting issues later on. So yeah. So not only do the vaccines work, but they, in terms of reducing your odds of experiencing these outcomes, what about being vaccinated too much? Well, here's something published in The Lancet, Infectious Diseases. The title of the study, or correspondence here, Adaptive Immune Responses Are Larger and Functionally Preserved in a Hyper-Vaccinated Individual. This is from March 4, 2024. So essentially, what this article is a case study on a 62-year-old male, hyper-vaccinated individual, as they describe him, from Magdeburg, Germany, who deliberately and for private reasons received 217 vaccinations against SARS coronavirus 2 within a period of just over 2 years, 29 months. And this occurred outside of a clinical study context, so he was not studied, getting all of these. But what they found was he was basically fine. This guy got over 200 COVID vaccines. I mean, there's no reason to do that, really. But he did, because somebody was going to do it. What's their summary? In summary, our case report shows that SARS coronavirus 2 hypervaccination did not lead to adverse events and increased the quantity of spike-specific antibodies and T cells without having a strong positive or negative effect on the intrinsic quality of adaptive immune responses. While we found no signs of SARS coronavirus 2 breakthrough infections in him, that's their name for them, for this person to date, it cannot be clarified whether this is causally related to the hypervaccination regimen. So they didn't find that he had any breakthrough infections, but some people who aren't hyper-vaccinated don't get breakthroughs also. Importantly, we do not endorse hyper-vaccination as a strategy to enhance adaptive immunity, because they found that the adaptive immunity was not improved, but the spike-specific antibodies and T cells were. So there you go. Apparently, at least some people can get over 200 COVID vaccines in a 29-month period and be basically fine. I mean, whether this person had, significant enhanced benefits from that doesn't appear to be the case. Some slightly enhanced benefits, but yeah. As far as the vaccine hype, this guy got literally over 200. You have so much more to fear from an infection, which just causes rampant spike production in your body, as well as other harm. I mean, the spike itself is harmful and inflammatory, but there's other harm from an infection as well. Anyway, speaking of harm and speaking about getting rest with COVID, let's talk about exercise in COVID for a second. This is, again, from CNN Health. Take caution resuming your fitness routine after COVID, and then they're lumping them all in together. RSV or influenza, experts say. I'm not going to get super into this article, but it's what I was saying before. You have to rest if you get infected. If you just run with it, and as soon as you feel slightly better and your fever goes down, you go back to normal levels of activity, including exercise, you are upping your risk of causing a complication. Do not do it. You need to take time. If you want to look at those recommendations, look up that article. But again, that is the basic principle here. People need to take rest a lot more seriously. Kind of finally, as far as the articles go, I wanted to highlight some work from the Canadian COVID Society. So the Canadian COVID Society launches to address long-term effects and prevent further illness. This is an article from the Canadian Press, and good for them, I guess. So a national nonprofit group called the Canadian COVID Society launched on Wednesday with co-founders saying that the organization is needed as public health agencies have pulled back on COVID-19 prevention measures and awareness campaigns. Quote, I feel in some ways we are filling a gap where public health has dropped the ball, where they're filling a gap that public health has left open. Dr. Joe Vipond, one of the Society's 5 co-founders, said at a news conference. In his home province of Alberta, quote, there's basically no mention of COVID. There's no mention of long COVID. It's really fallen off the radar for a lot of public health at this point, said Vipond, who is an emergency physician in Calgary. Quote, while the acute phase of the pandemic has ended, I would be curious of how you're characterizing the acute phase as far as people just dropping dead en masse. That I think that's a potentially really misleading statement, as we saw is currently circulating in the U.S. higher than ever for this time of year. Anyway, the virus continues to cause significant chronic illness, the Canadian COVID Society's website says. COVID-19 was the third leading cause of death across Canada in 2022, behind heart disease and cancer, it says. Quote, it still continues to be a stressor on our health system, Up to this present day, it is contributing to poor health and excess deaths, said Dr. Kashif Pirzada, another co-founder of the society. So the article goes on, and this actually kind of reminds me of something, like when in the US we have the People's CDC, which doesn't really get enough press. I've linked to them on the channel. If you go into the home tab or click the about, I forget even where to find that. I think it's if you scroll down to the bottom of the home tab on youtube.com/socialism for all, or at socialism for all. I linked to the People's CDC, but I think they only have like a couple thousand subscribers. I don't think that they're really getting that much attention. It falls to other people. As somebody who is somewhat educated on these topics, I want to do more where I see that there is a need. I had somebody kind of raging in the comments about this, actually. They're like, you're just filling in for, like, you're doing the work of like an NGO. You have to tie it into imperialism. I'm like, well, first of all, if harm is being done by this thing, and I know something about that, and I have something to say about that, I'm going to say something about it. And they were just getting really mad that I was, doing work that the government should be doing. Okay, but they're not doing it, so it still needs to be done. Yes, I'm going to do it. And yes, it is tied in with capitalism. We've discussed that like a million times. But I think I just posted something related to COVID on the community tab. And I got this like, I think you're mad at the wrong people there. I get this a lot, but anyway. I get that when we're talking about really angering social issues, sometimes that anger bleeds over, but try to keep that in check. Anyway, I wanted to, in closing out this week's COVID segment, hype a couple of lists here. So this is at COVID Aware. If you go to Linktree, linktr.ee/covid.aware, AWARE. You can find this Linktree where they have a number of resources to, and there's the People's CDC on Substack. You can see a bunch of resource lists related to staying up to date on COVID and why you should stay up to date on COVID. And then this is another one that I have shared in the community tabs and I think mentioned in streams before. This is Linktree, linktr.ee/capitalism and disability. It's actually created by a listener who I am in touch with, and they're doing great work. This is a super long set of options. You want to tie COVID into capitalism and imperialism? Here you go. There's your list. Linktr.ee. There's no real easy way to say it. Linkter.ee. There's like no good way to say that. /capitalism and disability. And you'll find this great guide connecting, ableism, capitalism, disability, and COVID. So there you go. All right, so switching now into the rest of U.S. politics, it's a presidential election year. So what's going on with that? Well, the Democratic Party is running an incumbent who obviously has the sort of home team advantage that all incumbents have. Incumbents almost always get reelected. But they're running a guy, Joe Biden, with a 37% approval rating. I'm not sure what exactly is going into that, but they don't appear to even be trying to win this election. And instead, they're touting Joe Biden as, quote, the most progressive president of our lifetimes. What are you even talking about? He's presiding. I mean, it just isn't. No president is particularly progressive, but especially not Joe Biden. What do we have here? President Biden job approval. This is from Real Clear Polling. So, that last one was from Reuters. But, yeah, here you've got basically the same thing. You've got like a 38, 39, 40% approval rating. That's pretty bad. And then if you look, compared to previous administrations, the job approval by March 14th of the fourth year, you've got Biden at 39.8 on this average, which includes a bunch of different polls. Rasmussen, USA Today, Forbes, Emerson, Financial Times, TIP, New York Times, Fox News, The Economist, YouGov, and so on. So Biden's got 39.8. Trump, who lost re-election, had a 44.6. Obama had a 47.1, did win re-election. Bush, George W. Bush had a 49.6. Okay, fucking George Bush had a 49.6 in his fourth year, March 14th. And, Obama and Bush won re-election. They had a 47.1 and a, 50, basically, if you round it. Trump lost re-election with a 44.6 at this point, a little bit lower, and also was Trump. I mean, there was like so much outrage at things that Trump was doing. There was also outrage at things that Bush was doing. But, the system, the confidence in the system was so much more intact at that point versus by the time it got up to Trump. There really needs to be a more in-depth analysis of the ways that the Bush government kind of broke the system as it had existed up to that point. At some point, someday we will get into that. For the time being, actually, I have a documentary from the BBC uploaded to the channel. It's called War Party from 2003. If you're not super familiar with what happened during the Bush-Cheney years, start with War Party, because it'll give you a bit of a glimpse into the fucking madness that was happening at that time that really it set the tone for everything that has followed since, and nobody will fucking talk about it. But yeah, Trump didn't get elected because he was in like the beginnings of the pandemic, and people are like, well, Biden's going to do a better job with that. So what are Biden's odds really of being this unpopular and already, facing off against Trump in the polls? It's I think the last poll, we put this up on the community tab, it was like Biden 42, Trump 47 or something like that, was like, if the election was held today, who would you vote for? And so this is filtering back to the Democrats. My point about saying they don't seem to be trying to win is the next time that you encounter somebody either in real life or online that's like, but Trump and you got to vote for Biden because it's all, I mean, look, I think it's scary too. We're not in great times right now, but thinking that Democrats are somehow going to fix this is just like nonsense. Just tell them, look, if the Democrats were actually trying to win, they'd run somebody else. They're not, so like, fuck them. You're not going to put this on us. That's why I offer that. But even the Democratic Party is getting it from their own voters. This is from Newsweek. Joe Biden voters tell him to drop out. And, people, supporters of Biden, will frequently complain about how the New York Times runs a million articles about how old Joe Biden is. That isn't really the issue. I mean, for the New York Times it is, because they want somebody who will do all the things that Joe Biden is doing, but just is less old. I mean, obviously for us, the problem is more what he's doing than his age. But anyway, according to this article, a majority of those who voted for Joe Biden in 2020 would support him dropping out of the 2024 White House race, according to a new poll conducted exclusively for Newsweek. It surveyed 1,500 eligible U.S. voters and found 54% of those who had voted for Biden in 2020 want him to leave the current race. Only 21% would actively oppose Biden switching out, which sounds about right to me. Like, only 1 in 5 really want Biden specifically to stay in. Those who voted Democrat in 2020 are more likely to support Biden dropping out than the general public. Like, it's people who really take it more seriously, I think, and are more concerned, among whom 45% want the sitting president to step aside, while 30% are opposed. This was conducted on March 2nd. And there's some more breakdown of what was asked in that poll in that article. But I mean, I think, again, what this speaks to is widespread unpopularity of Biden. And here's an example of that that doesn't, have anything to do with his age. This is from Speaking Security, written by Stephen Semler. Biden ignores the child care crisis while lobbying for Israel. This is from March 4. So the article I just wrote for The Intercept and the Economic Hardship Reporting Project compares the level of effort that Joe Biden put toward advancing 2 funding proposals, the first for foreign aid and the second for domestic needs, both of which he introduced in late October. He fought harder for the first than he has for any other proposal. He completely ignored the second. If there's one case study to illustrate where Biden and the Democratic Party are politically right now, this might be it. Biden didn't fight for $16 billion to mitigate the childcare crisis, but did push for $16.5 billion for Israel's war in Gaza, which has killed over 12,500 children. So, I mean, the article goes on. There's just one example. And Israel. So it is an election year, and Israel having some role in that. Somebody mentioned this in a previous stream and sent in an article which I hadn't seen before, but I think is worth sharing in this context. People were really up in arms about, I think, the manufactured hysteria around Trump and Russia, which did seem to kind of be a nothing burger once it was picked into as far as their, quote, election interference. You want to talk about that? Talk about, this is a super long article, by the way, in The Nation. The Trump campaign's collusion with Israel. While U.S. media fixated on Russian interference in the 2016 election as a convenient excuse for Hillary Clinton to, explain away her awful campaign and completely embarrassing loss. An Israeli secret agent's campaign to influence the outcome went underreported. It says unreported. And so this is from last April 2023, so published about 11 months ago. It was written by James Bamford, who is a guy who has written, I think he's ex-NSA or ex-CIA. So he's the guy who did the Operation Northwoods thing in the context of people looking at the 9/11 attacks. He wrote material about the declassified Operation Northwoods operation, which would have been a false flag setup of Cuba by the U.S. in the 60s, which was nixed by JFK. It was basically a plan to run drone planes, which would then be have fake distress calls, and then they would be blown up over Cuba, and then blamed to start a war with Cuba. And this would be tied in. This was dreamed up by General Lyman Lemnitzer in the U.S. military, and it would be blamed on Cuba and tied in with false flag terrorist attacks in Florida. And so it would basically be used to hype up public support for a U.S. invasion of Cuba after the revolution in Cuba. So, this is the kind of stuff that the U.S. does. Bamford has written about that in the past. But this is an incredibly long article that goes into a huge amount of detail, and I did want to point it out because it was mentioned by a commenter in a previous stream. Israel has enormous influence in U.S. elections. It's another thing when, the next time the Democrats are doing a round of voter shaming and, most important election of our lifetimes, why are you letting all of these interest groups, have so much sway in the election? So here's an article from Politico. AIPAC, which is the main Israel interest lobby in the U.S., uncorks a $100 million war chest to sink progressive candidates. Building on a successful playbook from 2022, AIPAC and other aligned groups are picking their targets, many more of them this time. And so in the picture is California State Senator Dave Min, who has faced a barrage of attack ads funded by AIPAC, focused largely on his DUI arrest last year. So I would expect a lot of that this year, as what you hear among pro-Israeli interest groups and media is behind the scenes they are very concerned about the dropping public support. They really overplayed their hand in the genocide and ethnic cleansing that they're doing in Palestine, and it's finally catching up with them in a major mainstream way. This has long been the case that anyone on the left, and even left liberal, has opposed or wanted to see changes with what was going on with Israel. Now it's really hitting the mainstream like never before, and Israel's freaked out. Expect them to be making more forays into trying to manipulate the politics. Another long article, but check it out if you're interested. So this is another one. We talked about the uncommitted campaign in the last stream, 112. Here's an article from The Guardian. Michigan Democrats have sent Biden a flashing warning sign about the election. Voters want Biden to drastically change course on Gaza and deliver a ceasefire. Only stopping Israel's war will assuage voters. So the issues are being laid out for you. If you don't listen, it's because you weren't trying to win. There's another article here. If Biden loses in November, don't blame voters who are angry over Gaza, by Arwa Madawi. We all know how devastating a second Trump term would be. It's also important to understand the damage that Biden is doing by funding what can plausibly be described as a genocide. Forced relocation of, entire populations, that is ethnic cleansing. So, it's being spelled out. What do you want to do about it? What they're deciding to do is to press ahead with an extremely aggressive campaign, which I'll credit Chad Loader for pointing this one out on Blue Sky. Biden is to the right of Reagan on this. Even Ronald Reagan, of all people, did far more to stop Israeli atrocities than Biden has done, and that's not saying much. Your lack of imagination is part of the problem as far as what else could he be doing. And it says, I'm not exaggerating. So there's a highlighted clip here from another article. Let me get the source one on this. This is from the Shoah After Gaza. Shoah is a term for the Holocaust, by Pankaj Mishra. This is from March 2024. And it says, in 1972, a year before he killed himself, the Austrian writer Jean Amery came across press reports of the systematic torture of Arab prisoners in Israeli prisons. Arrested in Belgium in 1943 while distributing anti-Nazi pamphlets, Amery himself had been brutally tortured by the Gestapo and then deported to Auschwitz. He managed to survive, but could never look at his torments as things of the past. This is typically what happens with trauma. It's very hard, though possible, and there's a lot more research and therapies for trauma now, but it tends to stick with you. He insisted that those who are tortured remain tortured and that their trauma is irrevocable. I certainly think it should never be forgotten. I also want to point out we have been living in a medical and even a mental health system which has been somewhat trauma-phobic up until extremely recently. If you suffer from trauma, I think trauma formally is defined as like having your life threatened or believing your life is threatened, other like serious grievous injury like that. Other people argue for a more expansive definition of trauma, but basically a lot of mental health suffering is caused by trauma, which is one event which has a lasting negative impact. There's a lot more therapy, there's a lot more research, there's a lot more treatment now, so that may have been true in the past, but there's a lot more that can be done for trauma now. Anyway, continuing. Like many survivors of Nazi death camps, Amery came to feel an existential connection to Israel in the 1960s. He obsessively attacked left-wing critics of the Jewish state as thoughtless and unscrupulous, and may have been one of the first to make the claim, habitually amplified now by Israel's leaders and supporters, that virulent anti-Semites disguise themselves as virtuous anti-imperialists and anti-Zionists. Of course, there is some amount of right-wing cloaking of like, no, we're just your typical anti-imperialist, anti-Zionist. It's usually pretty easy to see through that, but anyway. Yet the, quote, admittedly sketchy reports of torture in Israeli prisons prompted Amery to consider the limits of his solidarity with the Jewish state. Like, that would be a red line, something he absolutely could not support if it turned out to be true. In one of the last essays he published, he wrote, quote, I call urgently on all Jews who want to be human beings to join me in the radical condemnation of systematic torture. Where barbarism begins, even existential commitments must end. So again, going back to the first thing, where does Biden fit into all this? It's a quote from there. In 1982, shortly before Reagan bluntly ordered Menachem Begin to cease his, quote, Holocaust in Lebanon, a young U.S. senator who revered Elie Wiesel as his great teacher met the Israeli prime minister. In Begin's own stunned account of the meeting, the senator commended the Israeli war effort and boasted that he would have gone further even if it meant killing women and children. So you remember the outrage when Trump was like, we should go after terrorists' families. That's literally what Biden is saying here. Yet, where's the outrage? Begin himself was taken aback by the words of the future U.S. President, Joe Biden. No, sir, he insisted. According to our values, it is forbidden to hurt women and children, even in war. This is a yardstick of human civilization, not to hurt civilians. I mean, and again, they had already trampled on human rights in various ways, but apparently that was, Begin's thing. But Biden was like, kill them all, kill them all. Yeah, it'd be great, kill them all, man. So, there's Joe Biden again. For anyone confused about why Biden is so enthusiastically supporting Israel and refusing to draw a red line, well, that's him 42 years ago. Maybe not that much has changed. Anyway, about the flower massacre that we covered in the last stream, and that actually is the thumbnail of Livestream 112, there's a news release here from the UN Human Rights Office in the occupied Palestinian territory, Ramallah. This is dated 1st of March 2024. The flower massacre, where Israel opened fire, including tank fire, on starving people, they're systematically starving in Gaza, showing up for food, it wasn't the first time, as this documents. So what's going on in Israel, in Palestine, as far as what Israel is doing, it's worse than I think anyone. It's hard to keep up with how bad it is. You've heard stories, they may be terrible. It's even worse than that. Like, the stories you've heard are just kind of, what can be relayed in a certain amount of time. But if you keep going, the story keeps going. Headline: Israel is deliberately starving Palestinians, UN rights expert says. This is from The Guardian by Nina Lakhani. Exclusive: UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Michael Fakhri, sorry, the text is small, says that the denial of food is a war crime and constitutes a, quote, situation of genocide. Israel is intentionally starving Palestinians and should be held accountable for war crimes and genocide, according to the UN's leading expert on the right to food. And we'll go a little bit further into this particular article, but let's just say this is a very well-established area in international law. It's not like this is some murky, uncharted territory. This is extremely clear. Israel knows exactly what it's doing. And so do all the other countries that so far are not intervening because the U.S. is protecting them, and they're not struggling very hard. We want to hear that, Russia is so anti-imperialist. What the fuck are they doing here? Where is the organized, resistance to this? If it's going on, I'm not seeing it. Let me know in the comments. But, meanwhile, there's a Chinese company building a subway system for Israel not long ago, as far as the, quote, anti-imperialism, pseudo-anti-imperialism. Hunger and severe malnutrition are widespread in the Gaza Strip, where about 2.2 million Palestinians are facing severe shortages resulting from Israel destroying food supplies and severely restricting the flow of food, medicines, and other humanitarian supplies. Aid trucks and Palestinians waiting for humanitarian relief have come under Israeli fire. Quote, there's no reason to intentionally block the passage of humanitarian aid or intentionally obliterate small-scale fishing vessels, greenhouses, and orchards in Gaza other than to deny people access to food, Michael Fakhri, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, told The Guardian. So, and you can see a chart there. Aid entering Gaza dropped to 98 daily truckloads in February, down from a pre-conflict average of 500 to 600. So for every 5 or 6 trucks that previously was going in, there's now only one. So that's a gigantic reduction in the aid that is going in there. So that's what they're doing as far as on a mass scale, just depriving people of food. And that article goes on extensively. In the interest of time, there's so much to cover here. Here's another article. Headline: We are the masters of the house. Israeli channels air snuff videos featuring the systematic torture of Palestinians. Hard to believe, here we are. Israeli TV channels aired a number of reports showing the torture and humiliation of Palestinians in Israeli prisons. The videos are consumed by the public as entertainment, revealing the sadism of Israeli society. This sounds crazy, and it could be considered as Israel's Abu Ghraib moment, when the pictures came out of the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq of what the U.S. occupation was doing there, torturing people in so many different dehumanizing ways. The difference is that the reaction in the U.S. was outrage and disgust by and large. Very few people actually supported that. It's just people were kind of in the dark about what the U.S. was doing there. They're airing it on TV, according to this report, in Israel. And this kind of aligns, to my mind, with the reports of Israelis actually going out and saying that the government, the Israeli government, in their minds, isn't doing enough to harm the Palestinians, and they're going out and trying to block additional humanitarian aid. There's like random people. How are they spending their time? What are they doing with their resources? They're going out and trying to kill literally every last Palestinian. So anyway, over the past month, mainstream Israeli television channels have aired what can only be described as snuff films. They depict the systematic torture of Palestinians from Gaza in Israeli jails. Such videos have aired on at least 3 occasions, twice on Channel 14 and once on the public broadcaster Channel 13. While Channel 14 is considered right-wing, so is about 2/3 of the Israeli public, and the more mainstream Channel 13 has no qualms about airing similar footage. So you want to know, like, why the Israeli public is demanding this. It's what the Zionist effort there has shaped the Israeli public into. And once you've shaped a public in this direction, this is what they crave and what they actually demand of their government. The broadcasts follow prison officials into detention centers to document the mistreatment of prisoners, which seems to be something that the officials and apparently the viewers find satisfying rather than revolting. The airing of these snuff films is a demonstration of societal sadism. As Yumna Patel has recently reported, several rights groups have sounded the alarm over the widespread and systemic abuse that Palestinian prisoners face at the hands of the Israeli authorities. These groups' calls have been unintentionally buttressed or supported by Israeli soldiers' unapologetic videos of themselves torturing or demeaning Palestinian detainees, which they boastfully post on social media. Now, it seems that this isn't just a few accounts. The phenomenon has expanded to mainstream Israeli television. The 2 aforementioned reports on Channel 14, threads with subtitles can be found here and here with links, contained footage of actual interrogation sessions during which torture was used. The Channel 13 report didn't, but it exposed some of the worst prison conditions to be broadcast to the public. These conditions include forcing prisoners to live in inhumane conditions and subjecting them to torture and harassment. So then they link the 11-minute video with translated subtitles. There's the picture of it. The feeling is one of pride. Quote, "Here we see the cells in which the Nukba terrorists are held," the narrator says. The Nukba refers to elite Hamas-led fighters who carried out the October 7 attack. In the cell, viewers notice metal bunk beds without mattresses, and instead of a toilet, there's just a hole in the floor. The room is almost completely dark throughout the day, and prisoners have their hands and legs chained together. We hear attack dogs barking constantly as prisoners are made to kneel while bound and blindfolded, their heads touching the floor. "This is how it should be," a guard says. "This is how a Nukba prisoner should be. What happened on October 7 will never return." In another scene, a guard shouts at prisoners as dogs continue to bark incessantly. Heads down, heads on the floor, he yells. So anyway, it goes on. There's a few more, the article goes on for a few more screens. Amid some of this, there has been some pushback as Israel is really, overstepping what anyone seems to be willing to support. So there's an article here. I guess I saved the beginning of this as something else. Let me just find the headline there. There it is. Canada and Sweden restore UNRWA funds as a report accuses Israel of torturing agency staff. Okay, so we've got the torture being shown on television. There's also reports of Israel torturing this UN agency staff. And so UNRWA was defunded for a while. Canada and Sweden have now restored those funds. Quote, "The work that UNRWA does cannot be overstated," said Canadian lawmaker Salma Zahid. "It will save lives, as we've seen the visuals of children dying of hunger in Gaza. The need for immediate aid is non-negotiable." So starting the article, the governments of Canada and Sweden have announced that they will resume funding for the United Nations agency that provides humanitarian aid and protection to Palestinians living in Gaza and elsewhere. A move that Other powerful nations, including Israel's most powerful ally, the United States, continue to refuse, calling the lack of humanitarian relief inside Gaza catastrophic. I mean, what can you even say? Like, you need relief, but also stop them from fucking leveling the north of Gaza, you know? The Canadian Minister of International Development, Ahmed Hussein, said Friday that his nation would restore funding for the UN Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, for Palestinian refugees in the Near East in order to help address the, quote, dire situation on the ground living. Sweden made its announcement Saturday and said that a $20 million disbursement would be made to help UNRWA regain its financial footing. I mean, great, but there are really, really serious problems going on there. So the article goes on. I'm saying that a lot, but I really pulled a lot of articles that we can't read every word of. Continuing on, though, here's Joe Biden announcing recently a plan for a temporary port on Gaza's coast to increase the flow of humanitarian aid. Hey, fucko, why don't you just make Israel let the aid through? Then you wouldn't need a pier. Do you think they're not going to attack the pier as well? Do you think that that's just going to go? How much kind of stepping around the problem of just, hear no evil, see no evil are you going to do here? This does not address the problem. So anyway, Biden will announce a plan in his State of the Union address Thursday for the U.S. military to help to establish a temporary port on the Gaza coast, increasing the flow of humanitarian aid for the beleaguered territory during the Israel-Hamas war. I mean, so it would, the U.S. military has, quote, unique capabilities and can do things from, quote, just offshore. I mean, or you could restrain Israel because it's literally the U.S. at every level who is directly enabling Israel to do what it's doing. Militarily, it is arming them. It's funding them economically. It's also parking warships around the world to prevent, and off of the coast directly, to prevent anyone from trying to intervene and stop Israel. It's diplomatically blocking every single resolution at the United Nations which would condemn Israel. They wouldn't be able to do this without the U.S., but you're building a pier. Aid groups have said that it has become nearly impossible to deliver supplies within most of Gaza because of the difficulty of coordinating with the Israeli military, the ongoing hostilities, and the breakdown of public order. The U.S. military recently began airdropping aid into Gaza. I'll mention one of those airdrops actually killed people. I forget if it was the parachute malfunctioning or whatever. I mean, some of that, just stop the fucking bombing. Pull Israel back. Nobody really wants to see this happening, and yet on it goes. Why is that? Who's enabling this? These are simple questions that are just not really being answered, to some extent asked sufficiently, and then definitely not being answered in a way that's going to lead to a clear solution. But increasingly, I don't know where Israel goes after this, because the world is turning on them, as they should be. This is reprehensible and totally unsupportable. So the U.S. Green Party had a statement on this. Green Party, Gaza needs a ceasefire, not a pier. Political stunts like Biden's pier are not designed to halt the suffering. And so I share this, as I said before, there are some kind of left parties in the U.S., not necessarily communist, but more people even engaging in these would, first of all, do some good, and then also provide, experience, knowledge, and just a basis for criticism and dialogue within the left. Anyway, continuing, the Green Party of the United States called on President Biden to demand an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, dismissing his call for a humanitarian pier as grossly ineffective in responding to the death and suffering of Palestinians. Quote, given the completion of the pier will take approximately 2 months, many Palestinians will continue to die from starvation. Direct delivery of aid into the area, as well as safe entry for the waiting aid trucks, will provide at least some relief to those in need, primarily women and children, said Jennifer Sullivan, spokesperson for the National Women's Caucus within the Green Party. The party said that at a minimum, Biden should insist on opening new border crossings to provide immediate food, water, and medical supplies to the millions of Palestinians facing starvation. Many aid trucks, although, of course, if you do this, more people can actually see what's happening there, and that's the last thing that they want. Many aid trucks are waiting to get into Gaza at the Rafah crossing. Only an immediate and lasting ceasefire will enable the massive humanitarian response needed after 5 months of Israel's indiscriminate bombardment of Gaza. Quote, the killing of tens of thousands of Palestinians, including many children and women, with United States tax dollars, needs to be halted immediately. The Biden administration is guilty of war crimes for its complicity in aiding this genocide in Palestine. Political stunts like Biden's peer are not designed to halt the suffering in Gaza, but rather are just callous attempts to prop up his plummeting poll numbers, said Darrell Mock, National Party co-chair. As Israel's military raids continue across the West Bank, in addition to the assault on Gaza, its government has approved the expansion of several thousand illegal settler homes in the occupied territories. Israel's assault on Gaza is an extension of its ongoing land grab from Palestinians. The Green Party platform states, quote, we reject the grossly unbalanced financial and military support of Israel by the U.S., while Israel occupies Palestinian lands. We also reject U.S. political support for Israel and demand that the U.S. government end its veto of Security Council resolutions pertaining to Israel. We urge our government to join with the UN to secure Israel's complete withdrawal to, at least, the 1967 boundaries and comply fully with international law. And that is the Green Party of the United States statement about that. Vice President Kamala Harris called for a, quote, immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The vice president pushes Israel to do more to help Palestinians. I'm sorry, does it look like they're trying to do anything to help Palestinians? They're doing ethnic cleansing. What are you talking about? Quote, no excuses. Wow. If only Kamala Harris had some power. If only she could do something. If only she was, I don't know, the vice president of the United States. So, more just absolutely empty posturing from this genocidal administration. And speaking of, there is a map. If you want to see where in the United States is providing the weapons. So this is an article from Truth Out. Activists unveil a map of facilities actively producing weapons for Israel. Palestine Solidarity activists' research revealed the expansive, tangled web of the arms production process. This is from March 7th, so 11 days ago. And basically in there is a map. Let me see if I can find the actual thing. There it is. So there's a screenshot of the map to give you some idea of different locations around the U.S., and you can find that link in the article that I just read the headline of if you look up that headline. And, you know, people have been doing protests and different things in front of these weapons facilities. I think if you look through that article, actually, there are probably some pictures there of protests being held in front of those places. Of course, I'm pulling up the screenshots without those pictures, but use your imagination. So what else is being done? I mean, because we do need to do whatever we can do to oppose this, and there are some labor unions that have been getting involved. So we saw the UAW, United Auto Workers. This is part of the, still in its infancy, but resurgence of labor in this country. This is an article from Common Dreams. UAW labor for Palestine's endorsement. They're endorsing uncommitted in Michigan. So this is, again, that uncommitted campaign. Biden has now won the presidential nomination in the Democratic Party primary. He didn't really face any strong competition. There was Marianne Williamson and a couple of other people. None of them were really doing any serious numbers, is what I mean. But people were voting uncommitted in droves, just as a vote of no confidence, basically against Joe Biden. And so the UAW for labor was part of this. So people sometimes say, the U.S. Labor movement, being from the first world, it's not internationalist in any way. Here's an example of some U.S. organized labor overcoming that and engaging in some internationalism and using the clout that they have as organized labor to make internationalist political demands. So we want to see more of that, absolutely. And then kind of along the same lines, there was out of India, this headline: the Water Transport Workers Federation of India refuses to load or unload Israel-bound weapons on any ships. So we need to understand there's different levels of protest. There is symbolic protest, which is, doesn't directly affect supply chains or things like that. But, I mean, it's still a risk, and it is still, in the political side of things, somewhat meaningful. Then there's also, using your strength as organized labor to actively do what the workers want to do. So in this case, they are saying no. So here's the article. The Water Transport Workers Federation of India, which represents more than 3,500 workers at 11 major ports in the country, said that they will not load or unload weaponized cargoes from Israel or any other nation which carries military equipment to be taken to Palestine. So that is the kind of thing that we need to see increasingly as time goes on. Quote, port workers, part of labor unions, would always stand against the war and killing innocent people like women and children. The recent attack of Israel on Gaza, plunging thousands of Palestinians into immense suffering and loss. Women and children have been blown to pieces in the war. Parents were unable to recognize their children killed in bombings as bombs were exploding everywhere, the union said in a press release. Calling for a, quote, immediate ceasefire, the trade union said, quote, our union members have collectively decided to refuse handling all types of weaponized cargoes. Loading and unloading these weapons helps to provide organizations with the ability to kill innocent people, unquote. The press release said, as responsible trade unions, we declare our solidarity with those who campaign for peace. We call upon the workers of the world and peace-loving people to stand with the demand of a free Palestine. So there you go. That is, unionized workers, of course, will lobby for increased pay, improved working conditions, and all that kind of stuff as part of the overall class struggle. But you can also engage in internationalist actions like that. And this is a preview of what you can do under socialism, because that's obviously under capitalism, just labor is a counterpower. The main power is capital. Labor organizes itself as a counterpower, but then at some point, if there is a proper struggle, they can depose capital and become the dominant power, at which point capital becomes the counterpower, and then there's a proletarian state constructed to outlaw capitalism and suppress the capitalists until capitalism is eradicated. But yeah, this is a preview of what you can do under socialism when workers are in charge and exercising proletarian international solidarity. So that's really key. Speaking of unions, though, let's go right into, I know we got to get back to the chat at some point. I have no idea. The chat could be completely in flames by this point. But I did want to mention, people are talking about the ACLU trying to destroy the Biden NLRB. So this is a really weird article. It's from NLRB Edge. I mean, it's a good article. It's a really weird story by Matt Bruning. The ACLU is also trying to force more workers into mandatory arbitration. So this is a clash between the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, long known for fighting a lot of positive fights for civil liberties, and the NPEU, the Nonprofit Professional Employees Union. So here's the article. Earlier this week, the National Labor Relations Board, or NLRB, issued a two-page decision denying the ACLU's request to appeal an administrative law judge's decision to not defer a dispute with one of its former employees to arbitration. Like most progressive organizations, the ACLU has historically supported access to the courts and opposed forcing workers and consumers into arbitration. Yet this case reveals that the ACLU has arbitration agreements with its employees and is doggedly trying to use those agreements to keep them from accessing the NLRB. So this is like somewhat reminiscent of at TYT, one of the very first stories that I did way back in the day on Socialism for All was about how Cenk Uygur was trying to break the TYT union that was forming. Like, you're so progressive except when it lands in your lap, right? So it seems like another case of that. This is kind of a long article. We won't go through the whole thing today, but as they say, digging into the case reveals something even more surprising than run-of-the-mill hypocrisy from a progressive employer. In this proceeding, the ACLU is not merely attempting to have the case deferred to arbitration under existing board law. It is also trying to expand board law to force workers into arbitration in circumstances where they currently have a right to have their disputes heard by the NLRB, or National Labor Relations Board. So, and then they go into what is arbitration deferral and etc. But so the ACLU is, in the course of fighting their union, potentially trying to wreck things or using a strategy that could wreck things for many workers. And so this goes into a broader thing that we're seeing right now. And as far as, like we talked about that commenter before, asking why the resurgence in fascism, because they're alarmed at even this level of labor resurgence, and they also know what the capitalist class has planned. 2008 was a massive ramping up of austerity, of, quote, shared sacrifice, where they try to make workers pay the cost of capitalism's losses. As the system has harder and harder times coming up with the profits that it needs, it is trying to just externalize any costs that it can onto workers. And they know that this is only going to get worse. And so they're trying to just, tear down anything that stands in the way of that. And having union rights is one thing that does. Although, it's like, as the saying goes, when unions are outlawed, only outlaws will have unions. This may not be the kind of thing that, because there were very intense labor struggles with very few rules prior to the NLRB. The NLRB helped to really systematize, in some ways co-opt the class struggle and sort of bring it into a framework that was more copacetic, more aligned with capitalism, where grievances that workers had could be resolved within the framework of capitalism. And so it necessarily kind of tamped down or gave workers an incentive not to pursue demands and conflicts that couldn't be resolved within the framework of capitalism. Well, so if you tear that down, I mean, it's maybe no holds barred again, free for all, where workers will start doing stuff that is currently, illegal. But if that entire legal framework gets torn down, who knows what will happen? Anyway, this is an article from the Economic Policy Institute, and from March 7th, titled "What's Behind the Corporate Effort to Kneecap the National Labor Relations Board? SpaceX, Amazon, Trader Joe's, and Starbucks are trying to have the NLRB declared unconstitutional after collectively being charged with hundreds of violations of workers' organizing rights." So this isn't exactly the same type of thing, but the NLRB is, as the labor struggle heats up again, and really just barely begun heating up again, the capitalist class is trying to really redefine what that struggle might look like. So here we go. Workers want unions now more than they have in a generation. Evidence suggests that more than 60 million non-union workers would like a union at their workplace. The National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, the agency established by Congress in 1935 to protect workers' organizing rights, or again, bring them more into a framework aligned with capitalism, is handling more union representation elections and unfair labor practice charges than they have in years. And again, if we get the kind of crash I'm expecting in the next few years, that is only likely to go up as workers realize more and more, hey, this system doesn't work for me, it's not stable, we need to protect ourselves. So how have companies responded to this surge in worker organizing? Some have honored their workers' choice and tried to start a positive labor management relationship, as Microsoft, New Flyer, Ben & Jerry's, and other companies have done. These companies see the value of a constructive relationship with their employees to their bottom line. So this is this kind of, unions are good for profits kind of thing. This is, I don't know what to say, but not if you're doing your union correctly, in other words. I mean, once the struggle starts heating up, I think you're going to see them changing their tune. For now, the unions are not terribly threatening, but as the crisis heats up again, we'll see. Others have taken the opposite tack to the extreme. Led by Elon Musk's SpaceX and joined by Amazon, Trader Joe's, and Starbucks, These companies are engaged in a legal battle trying to have the NLRB declared unconstitutional by resurfacing long-rejected constitutional arguments about the agency's structure. If they succeed, it would kneecap the agency and its operations at the very time that workers need it the most. So time out. Is that really what workers need? No, not unless you're trying to do just exclusively reformist, like, give me another bowl of gruel type stuff. What unions need to be doing is pairing themselves with revolutionary anti-capitalist political struggles and in fact generating some of the leaders of those struggles. What the NLRB is actually going to do in the long term is hold you back. What the NLRB has been useful for now, in the context of an overall weak labor struggle and weak labor movement, is, if you're trying to do a union campaign, which you have the legal right to do in your workplace, and your employer fires you for doing that, you can appeal to the NLRB that, hey, that's an unfair labor practice, and you might get back pay restored and things like that. So the thing is, though, and we've covered this in some of like the IWW organizing manuals that we have posted on the channel. If you want to find out how to organize a labor union, we have a playlist about that and several organizing manuals that will walk you through some of the specifics of that. The thing is, you don't need the NLRB to assert those rights if you have sufficient shop floor strength. In other words, what we really are trying to build here is the solidarity, militancy, and strength of the organized working class. The NLRB doesn't really directly play into that, but it can be helpful to workers in the context of an overall weak labor struggle. As we get stronger, it's just going to be a hindrance. We may or may not really be at that point yet, but long term, that is eventually what will happen. So workers who are very dismayed by this news, fear not, because where we're going, we don't need the NLRB. It's a matter of if you can win what you want just through the sheer force of your, people often think of striking, but striking like an actual walkout is kind of a last resort. There's many other kinds of industrial actions that you can do, like slowdowns, like there's all kinds of things that can put pressure on the boss short of an actual workout or like a walkout or work stoppage. And building your strength on the shop floor, it's all about switching the balance of power away from the bosses toward the workers. The more you're able to successfully do that through the sheer force of your organizing, and of course the company will respond with various kinds of tyranny, which in the short term will be unfair labor practices, and they're not legally allowed to do it. But long term, you're trying to build workers' strength. And when you have enough of that, you really don't need the government coming down on the employer for you. You can do it much more effectively. And in fact, at that point, it cuts both ways. Unfair labor practices can be used against the union as well, just as they can against the employer. So the employer will then go crying to the NLRB and say, they did an unfair labor practice, help us. And the NLRB is bound to do that. It's part of their duties. So as this, we'll keep an eye on this as this continues to heat up and as companies continue to attack the NLRB and try to knock it out of the way. Obviously, they'll try to retain whatever privileges they can for themselves out of the deal. But, just capitalist private property rights in the general capitalist court system is already significantly biased in their favor in the first place. So whether or not they need to hold on to this specific agency may or may not be the case. All right, I do have a section on the economy coming up, and I'm trying to, let's go to the chat first before we do that. So I'm going to go check back in on the chat. Hopefully things are not in shambles here. Let me go back up and find out. Oh, good. We didn't lose the chat. So we got 46 viewers. Let's keep chatting for a few minutes here, and then I'll do the last section on the economy. How does that sound? Okay. Got a lot of chat to catch up on, I'm sure. Company towns were common in my home state of West Virginia once upon a time. We had bloody battles over it. Yeah, look up the Coal Wars. If you've never learned anything about the Coal Wars, biggest conflict inside the United States after the Civil War. Communists fall into two categories, the ones who haven't done the fucking reading and the ones who have a reading pile that would last multiple lifetimes. There you go. You technically can fall into both of those categories, not having done the reading and having the pile, but yeah. I don't know where I'd be without S4A's readings. Same. I mean, they help me as much as they help anybody. Doing the readings here, I mean, I have to read them word for word. It really helps me to learn the material more thoroughly, which is why I started doing it this way in the first place, as motivation, honestly. I've just been constantly listening to the Spotify recordings at work. I still have some things to move over onto the Spotify, actually, probably coming soon, but yeah. Honestly, just started at the oldest and have been working straight through. I am so grateful for the Spotify and S4A. There we go. Well, I'm glad it's helping. And when I say that there's stuff that needs to be moved over, it's not the recent stuff. I think there's some like 2021, 2022 stuff that I haven't moved over, so that'll be coming at some point. The business across the street from me was striking, and it gave me so many opportunities to drop hints of collective action. There you go. Just be careful as far as what the managers over here or who's talking to the managers and friends with the managers. It's unfair to say that COVID is only the number 3 cause of death, considering that number 2 and 1 are both clusters of related diseases and not a single discrete cause of death. Yeah, I agree. And it feeds in, like I was saying. Okay, yeah, I'll have to send you some stuff about the Spanish Civil War. There's some particularly interesting material I know of by historian and Lovestoneite Robert Alexander, discussing the economic situation, how the anarchists shifted from being very idealistic to confronting the necessity of enforcing labor discipline. Oh God, I remember when we did the, I think it was something Luxembourg, maybe even, no, it was Socialization of Society, I think. Luxembourg, that mentioned labor discipline. I remember there's several people freaking out in the comments. Why would you need that? Well, called reality, friend. And leveraging the power of the state to achieve their ends. That does sound interesting. I'd be interested in seeing some more of that. Yeah, I've yet to get into the Jay Lovestone situation. Got to pick our battles, but it's coming up a lot in the Browderist stuff. People were already against Lovestone by that time. I'll have to maybe do an aside about... Here, let me make a note. I have to make an aside. Aside about Lovestoneism. Okay. I think they actually do get into it. Some of the later things in the 50s that talk about, like, against Browderism, Khrushchevism, Trotskyism, and Lovestoneism. It started becoming, like, the anti-revisionist, like, rubber band ball that they just kept sticking more things into. But, I mean, fairly, you know, it's fair enough to add those things in together. Oh, interesting. Also stuff by Burnett Bulletin about how in anarchist-controlled territory, you essentially required the express permission from the village council to travel outside of your village, and your spending habits were highly scrutinized by the council. How very anarchist. Yeah, indeed. I mean, it sounds more like what Cuba was describing as far as the revolutionary vigilance. So, yeah. We're not so different after all once you leave the realm of ideas and actually start trying to do this in reality. Americans are deeply sick in every possible way. I'll second that. The state of American healthcare and employment rights has a lot to answer for. I'd love to know its estimated death toll. Did I really have the wrong fucking thing up on the screen? There we go. But yeah, that is what Engels referred to as social murder. So I should have this somewhere in here. There you go. Social murder is a term coined by Friedrich Engels in 1845, used to describe murder committed by the political and social elite, where they knowingly permit conditions to exist where the poorest and most vulnerable in society are deprived of the necessities of life and are placed in a position in which they cannot reasonably be expected to live, and consequently will inevitably meet an early and unnatural death. So that is social murder, when the poor conditions you live in shorten your life. That topic came up recently in the post that we did. Actually, I might as well put this up on the screen too. The death toll of capitalism. I think this is actually the current post on the community tab. God bless America, land that I love. 2 billion plus murdered by capitalism, and then a laundry list of things. People kept being like, oh, you should add this on there. This isn't my meme, and it's from like 2014 or something. You add it. You want to see that on there, you add it. But yeah, I mean, point taken. This is just a sampling, but yeah, you got 2 billion plus right there. And add in all the social murder. Well, it's partly on there. Children killed by preventable disease and by hunger. And it's not just children, but yeah, absolutely. This is so scary to me, the COVID stuff. I have weak lungs. This stuff could seriously hurt people like me. Yeah, that's one of the most common things is shortness of breath afterwards. It does a lot of lung damage, SARS coronavirus 2 infection. Getting sick at the doctor, just like Nicholas's Russia. I had a heart infection a couple of years ago, so another COVID infection may kill me. I'm really sorry to hear that. Yeah, you have to mask because people around you have known and unknown health conditions. After we, exit childhood, we've all got something. We're all sick in some way. We all have some kind of weakness. And COVID just hits you in so many different ways. You got to mask up. You got to do it. N95 or better. Surgical masks aren't the worst. It's better than a cloth mask, but it doesn't make a firm seal around your mouth. It's more for like spittle. Surgical masks are. So, but the problem is that SARS coronavirus 2 can spread by aerosols. So it just hangs in the air like smoke. That's where you need something like an N95 that makes a tight seal around your mouth. I'm pre-diabetic and I do my best to avoid COVID because COVID can cause diabetes. Yeah, it can cause pancreatic damage. Absolutely. You don't have to tell me twice to mask up. People give me dirty looks, but I don't care. They can stay mad. I'd rather not get sick again. Absolutely. I got what you meant. I just stay home all day almost every day since most people in society are not wearing masks and I don't want to catch the thing. I will say, I go out, I just mask and, I haven't caught it to my knowledge since that initial thing, but, you can do it. I had to really, for a while, practice not really glaring at people who weren't masking, but I kind of got to that point. I still sort of reflexively, if somebody like who is not masked, which is basically everyone, coughs or something like without covering their mouth. I considered that rude before the pandemic, but now I'm like giving them dagger eyes kind of reflexively. I'm like, do you not know there's a fucking pandemic? Like, even if you think the pandemic is, quote, over, did you learn fucking nothing? Apparently not. Apparently they did not learn anything. I put anti-vaxxers on a similar level to flat earthers. The science is about the same, yeah. I am extremely fortunate in that I can require masks of my clients at work, but it definitely sucks to be isolated from social activity. Absolutely, it is complicated. I do social things just masked, How is the tendency of the rate of profit to fall? This is something pointed out by Marx. The end of capitalism. It isn't the end of capitalism. It is something that makes capitalism less stable, I guess you could say. But when the time has come where economy with private property doesn't make sense anymore in this future, the rich are still rich and the poor are still poor. So how does that actually stop it? It doesn't. I don't know why you're trying to attribute the position that it stops it to me or anyone else. I don't see anyone else making that argument. What it means is that capitalism becomes increasingly unstable. However, as we've said every single time this topic has come up, it does not end on its own. No matter, it can get so weak that a mere breeze could blow it over, but you've still got to muster up that breeze. You know what I mean? And the reality is what capitalism does is as it becomes more internally weak, as it lacks that inner strength of the growth and all of that, it becomes more outwardly, militarized, brittle, fascistic. And that's what we're going to see from now until the end of capitalism. Some of the revisionist predictions, like from Browder, like from Khrushchev, were that we went through World War II, the capitalists have kind of seen that, fighting for capitalism is just bringing lots of war and fascism, and so they're going to back off and they're going to play nice. That's not at all what they did. They actually doubled down and they just came up with fascism in new forms. They, read like the Jakarta method for how peaceable they were towards the Indonesian communists and so on. So No, capitalism, as it goes into further decay and decline, is going to use fascism more and more to try to organize society, just more and more brute force, because there's going to be obviously less in it for more and more people to support this, but they are trying to protect their profits and their status above society as the ruling class. So they're going to become more and more violent, and that's what you can expect from the end of capitalism. There are also, although the tendency of the rate of profit to fall over time is inexorable, it cannot be alleviated. There are short-term ways that capital can try to squeeze extra profit. So it's like the rate of profit from one year to the next goes down, or from one decade to the next goes down. They see that. They can still keep profits up through extra intensity of exploitation. So they come up with new ways to squeeze people. That's what I mean. It becomes more violent, more fascistic, and just more brutal and repressive generally. So it doesn't automatically end. It will try to preserve itself as long as it can by sheer force. That's what it will do. And what does happen is this sharpening class contradiction can lead to riper and riper opportunities for agitation, education, and organization. So, as those antagonisms come into sharper relief and are more and more obvious, just like after '08, just like is probably about to happen now, more and more people are like, hey, this, it's like an earthquake. You take the ground for granted until it shifts under your feet. And then you're like, holy fuck, I took the ground for granted, but that fucker moved, That shit just moved under my feet. Wow, the ground is a real thing, and we're just on a spinning ball of dirt. And the same thing happens with the economic system, where people are like, I guess this thing isn't so stable. I guess it's not just it's just there. I can't just take it for granted. We actually have to discuss this thing. And you see, there have been huge opportunities. We wouldn't be having this discussion right now. There wouldn't be enough interest in socialism and capitalism if it wasn't for like 2008 and all the stuff that happened after that. So, I mean, that keeps going. And it always takes a proletarian revolution in the end. But as far as the strength of the proletarian organization to find enough weaknesses, to find enough weak spots in the system, that may be a function, I think, at this point of, obviously like mid-20th century U.S. capitalism was pretty hard to knock down, but mid-21st century U.S. capitalism, if we make it that long environmentally, may not be so hard to knock down. You know what I mean? Hopefully that answers the question. But no, it doesn't end on its own. It always takes a revolution. The question is, like, when can you actually organize such a revolution? And it's always a question of relative strength between the working class and the ruling class. Maoists always leave me deeply confused. There's a prominent Maoist who has been a part of the communist movement here for decades who avidly supported the war in Iraq because it was going to bring modernization and democracy to the country. I just can't. Apparently we've never heard of national liberation struggles. Okay. Yeah, there's a comment, don't pay attention to what people label themselves, pay attention to their stated beliefs and actions. I think you should pay attention to what people label themselves, but be aware that there sometimes is a discrepancy between, there can be some distance between a person's stated beliefs, attitudes, and orientation and ideology and what they actually follow through. And sometimes, if you do pay enough attention, you can even see patterns. Like, a lot of people call themselves X, but I actually observe many of them being Y. And then you can theorize about, well, what is that connection where they think they're doing this, but they're actually really prone to this type of deviation? I think that actually is worth studying in, advancing the struggle and our understanding of the dynamics within it. But, I mean, your point is taken about, in the end, the label doesn't matter as, like, the label doesn't determine what they're going to do. But sometimes you do see patterns of, like, people call themselves this, but then they wind up having those kinds of, positions or whatever. There's a new siege on Al-Shifa. They kidnapped a journalist and, like, 60 other people. I cried when I heard Hein's story. I'm a substitute teacher, and I've taught 6-year-olds kids shouldn't have to suffer like this. She should have been going to school, making friends, having little fights about nothing with her friends. The aid drops killed people twice. It knocked out hospital solar panels. It is on purpose. Yeah. What's the bet that the pier is just Israel's first stages of building a marina that they're planning for the once the final and complete settlement of Gaza has been completed? Yeah, we have yet to see what really comes of that, if they even move forward with it at all. If they were maybe just floating that as like, will this get Biden's poll numbers up? You know? Yeah, I agree. So I agree with this comment. Personally, I lean more towards it's ultimately all for show for mainly American but also European audiences that don't really know what's going on. I think that that's probably likely. But yeah, people have speculated that it's like the beginning of more Israeli settlements. I think that, or somehow conjoined with that effort, but likely that it is just like an empty PR stunt for the U.S., which is literally making all of this happen and then trying to protect its image. Not that many views on the live streams. As a wise man once said, better fewer but better. Couldn't agree more. I mean, I could turn this into a really high traffic channel overnight. I see the other channels. The principles of doing it are very simple. They're very simple. Even to this day, the videos on, like I did a half a dozen React videos on Vosh in the first year or two. And I did like one on Destiny and Richard Wolff. That still gets tons of views. I mean, it's not hard to see how to do it, but I also don't, like, all you get when you do that is just lots of liberals who aren't really here for the communist content coming in. Like, what this channel is for learning communists, experienced communists that want to get involved and suggest resources and, maybe just discuss readings they've read years ago. Learning intermediate communists who, have been doing this for, like I have, like less than a decade, and they're well along the way, but they're trying to be involved in a study community. And then people who are starting to outgrow their relationship with reformism, they're starting to overcome those illusions, and they're more communist curious, and they're just beginners. Like, that's really who this channel is for, but it's all kind of directed in some way at building that up. And if you just do that other stuff, you're just building a liberal audience. And again, it's one thing to teach liberals communism. It's another thing to dumb down your communism so that you keep a big audience of liberals. I've talked about this with Jimmy Dore many times. I think that was the first, like, really solid example of it that I started mentioning, where, okay, he has this rift with TYT over the Hillary Clinton thing, and he wants to do the, quote, actually progressive show, but there's not the audience numbers. He wanted a channel bigger than TYT that made more money than TYT. He had to start grifting libertarians and MAGA people. So going where the numbers are is not a recipe for quality. It's just when you get into a pissing contest with some other channel over view counts or whatever, that's what that is. And I see that now with some other communist channels, or ostensibly communist channels, trying to go for those big numbers, and their audience is fucking liberals, and they're always going to be liberals. Okay? And you're actually not having the impact on them that you think you're having, if you even fucking care. But what you're doing is you're letting them remain as liberals while thinking that they can now speak the language of communists, and all that's going to do is, like AOC in 2018, 2019, coming into the left generally, throwing around terms like material conditions so that she can sell you the Democratic Party. That's all that does. I'm sorry, but you have to gatekeep, and just like a school classroom, gatekeeps, okay? I mean, yes, communist parties, there's a curriculum, you have to study, you have to engage in discussions. If you say stupid things, you get kicked out of the party. But in media, it's different. And when people are just going for millions and millions of subscribers and this and that, they're staying liberals. They just learned a little bit of the communist language. And I think that that's a really bad thing. Because then when you test them, you haven't had the impact you think you're having. You're watering down communism. It's the king of the hill meme. You're not you're not making liberalism better. You're making communism worse. So Yeah, better, fewer, but better indeed. I see a lot of protesters starting to wear masks again. It just makes them yell louder. There you go. Helps defeat facial recognition too. I will never be the same person after what Israel is doing right now, which is what a lot of Palestinians are saying. I agree. I mean, it's boots on ground, but what the fuck do they think that they're going to do? They have to win the war first. Jimmy Dore has gone borderline fascist on the border issue. I mean, he already went fascist on so many other issues, tailing RFK Jr. Yeah, I mean, he was just fucking like hyping up Tucker Carlson's video interview with Alex Jones. Jimmy Dore literally once spit in Alex Jones's face. All right, that's what Jimmy Dore actually thinks of Alex Jones, but now he's pumping him up as part of, he will just tail Tucker Carlson and tail RFK Jr. He's on the right. He is firmly on the right, and he did it for the money, and he did it for the followers. End of story. Because running an actually left channel doesn't give you the fucking numbers. So if you're serious about politics and the class struggle, you got to start and build. You can't just jump into, a pile of cash. It's like the ball pit at McDonald's, but full of cash. That's what Jimmy Dore jumped into, and it's full of MAGA and libertarians. And anyone actually on the left that shit behind a long time ago. Jimmy Dore has been fascist. He platforms and agreed with a Boogaloo Boy a couple of years ago. Yeah, I did a video on that. I titled it "What Zero Theory Does to a Motherfucker." Collapse by Vladislav Zubak is a guided tour of all the ways that Gorbachev was a revisionist in practice. Do you have any ideas how communists should address ideological differences? I need more specifics on that. I don't know what you mean. You know what? Let's do it. I've been going for like 4 hours, so I'm going to hold off on the economy stuff for today. We will move the economy stuff that I was going to do into... it's not particularly substantial, so we'll just do that as maybe the opener of the next stream. I plan to do this again this week. And so, yeah, it is 4 hours in, so we'll call it there. It's so long that my hunger pains actually went beyond, I can't even feel them anymore. So anyway, we will call it there. Good stream. That was number 113. Thanks to everybody who showed up. Thanks to Britt for moderating, and just thanks in general. This was a really good discussion, and we will continue catching up on all of this stuff. Maybe Thursday. I might be busy Thursday. If not, we'll do it soon, either like Saturday or next Monday or something like that. We will do number 114. But thanks to everybody for showing up, helping to make the stream what it is. And again, to the patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters, patreon.com/socialismforall and buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. We will see you in the next stream.